In June 1941, the German army fielded over 3 million soldiers for the invasion of the Soviet Union alone. Across Europe and North Africa, additional formations guarded coastlines, occupied territories, and supported Axis partners. Panzer divisions rolled with tanks weighing over 20 tons, artillery regiments fired shells exceeding 20 pounds each, and supply columns hauled hundreds of tons of ammunition and fuel forward every week. On paper, the Wehrmacht stood as the most experienced land force in the world, hardened by campaigns in Poland and France, where operational tempo fractured opponents within weeks. But breaking an army is not about a headline defeat. It is about eroding its arithmetic. The Allies did not attack the German army from a single direction. They applied pressure across continents. In the east, the Soviet Union absorbed and then reversed the invasion. In North Africa, British and later American forces collided with German formations under conditions measured in heat, dust, and fuel scarcity. In the West, strategic bombing campaigns targeted factories, rail hubs, and synthetic fuel plants. Each front consumed manpower and materiel that Germany could not replenish at equivalent rates. Consider production. By 1944, the United States alone produced tens of thousands of aircraft annually, and thousands of tanks weighing over 30 tons each. Liberty ships, displacing roughly 10,000 tons, rolled from shipyards in numbers exceeding 2,000 across the war. The Soviet Union relocated entire factories east of the Ural Mountains, transporting machinery weighing dozens of tons by rail before German forces could overrun them. German industry, under bombing that dropped thousands of tons of explosives on cities and infrastructure, struggled to maintain consistent output. Synthetic fuel production fractured under repeated air assault. Without fuel, tanks weighing 40 tons became stationary steel. Inside a German Panther tank during the summer of 1944, the crew felt the engine vibrate beneath armor several inches thick at the front. The 75mm gun fired shells weighing around 15 pounds. Yet fuel deliveries arrived irregularly. A single armored division required hundreds of tons of gasoline and ammunition weekly to sustain offensive operations. When rail lines were severed by bombing and bridges destroyed by advancing armies, resupply convoys stalled. Engines idled to conserve fuel. Movement slowed. The Eastern Front inflicted the heaviest bleed. At Stalingrad, an entire German field army numbering over 200,000 men was encircled and destroyed. Casualty rates in some divisions exceeded 70%. At Kursk, the largest tank battle in history saw thousands of armored vehicles collide across narrow sectors. German units committed tanks with armor measured in inches, and guns firing high-velocity rounds. Yet Soviet defensive belts layered anti-tank guns, mines, and artillery in depth measured in miles. The offensive stalled, losses mounted. When I once traced divisional strength returns from German Army Group Center between 1943 and 1944, what struck me was the steady thinning of effective manpower. Infantry divisions authorized at 15,000 men often fielded fewer than 10,000 fit for combat. Replacement drafts arrived younger, less trained. Veteran non-commissioned officers who once anchored cohesion were dead or wounded. Experience, once a decisive edge, eroded. Air superiority compounded the fracture. By 1944, Allied aircraft flew thousands of sorties daily over occupied Europe. Fighter bombers struck rail yards, fuel depots, and moving columns. A single aerial bomb weighing 500 pounds could disable a bridge that required weeks to repair. German troop movements shifted to night, slowing operational coordination. Artillery units struggled to reposition under constant reconnaissance. Every daylight convoy risked detection. In Normandy, after June 1944, German divisions attempting to counterattack against Allied beachheads collided with concentrated artillery fire, measured in tens of thousands of shells per day. Naval guns fired shells weighing over 100 pounds from offshore battleships. Allied forces landed hundreds of thousands of troops within weeks, supported by thousands of vehicles and tanks. German counterthrusts fractured under air interdiction and fuel shortages. The Falaise pocket encircled tens of thousands of German soldiers. Equipment losses included hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces abandoned in fields. Yet, breaking the German army was not solely about destruction of formations. It was about stripping strategic flexibility. On the Eastern Front, Soviet offensives in 1944 advanced hundreds of miles westward, annihilating entire army groups. In the west, Allied forces liberated France and approached Germany's borders. In Italy, grinding combat tied down additional divisions. Germany fought on multiple fronts simultaneously, each requiring reinforcements measured in tens of thousands of men. The German army's casualty figures climbed into the millions by 1945. Dead, wounded, missing. The numbers accumulated relentlessly. Industrial output could not match combined Allied production. Oil supplies dwindled to crisis levels. Synthetic fuel plants targeted by bombing reduced aviation gasoline availability, grounding aircraft. Without air cover, ground forces became more vulnerable. The feedback loop tightened. Imagine a German infantryman in late 1944, positioned in a trench along the Western Front. The ground trembles as Allied artillery fires hundreds of rounds within minutes. Overhead, aircraft engines drone. His division, once fully staffed, now fields companies at half strength. Ammunition is rationed. Orders arrive to hold ground regardless of cost. The strain is not abstract. It is hunger, exhaustion, and the knowledge that reinforcements will be fewer than before. Breaking an army also involves morale. Early in the war, rapid victories reinforced belief in invincibility. By 1945, that belief had fractured. Retreat replaced advance. Defensive lines shortened. Cities within Germany came under bombardment measured in thousands of tons of explosives per raid. Civilian infrastructure eroded alongside military capability. The psychological weight compounded operational strain. And here is something I have always found telling. When I reviewed German logistical memoranda from late 1944, the tone shifted from confident projection to constrained calculation. Fuel allocations were measured down to the leader. Divisions requested ammunition that could not be delivered. Commanders acknowledged that counteroffensives depended on capturing Allied fuel stocks. That is not dominance. That is desperation. The Allies broke the German army by outproducing it, outmaneuvering it, and forcing it to fight simultaneously across vast fronts. They severed rail lines, bombed factories, sank supply ships, encircled field armies, and denied airspace. They did not rely on a single decisive encounter. They applied pressure until cohesion eroded. If you are listening now, perhaps letting the quiet settle around you, imagine a long column of German vehicles halted at dusk, engines silent to conserve dwindling fuel. In the distance, artillery flickers. Overhead, aircraft hum faintly. Maps once marked with advancing arrows now show retreating lines. The weight is cumulative. Steel rusts. Ammunition runs low. Orders grow defensive. This is the entire history of how the Allies broke the German army. Chapter 1. The Clerks' War. The 15th of January, 1944. Somewhere inside a gray administrative building in Zossen, south of Berlin, a man sits at a desk stacked with carbon copy forms. The room smells of weak ersatz coffee and the particular mustiness of paper stored too long in poorly ventilated filing cabinets. His job title is unremarkable, a staff officer in the Replacement Army's organization branch, and his task this morning is arithmetic, simple arithmetic. He is comparing two columns of figures. The left column is labeled Soll-Starke, authorized strength. The right column is labeled Ist-Starke, actual strength. The left column hasn't changed much in months. The right column has been falling since the summer of 1943. And today, as he works through the Eastern Front tallies, the gap between the two is so wide that someone, perhaps this officer, perhaps a clerk, has circled the Ist-Starke number in red pencil and drawn a small, emphatic downward arrow beside it. No annotation, no memorandum attached, just the arrow. It sits in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg today, inside a folder of field strength reports, and it tells you more about the trajectory of the Second World War than most memoirs written by generals. This is not a story that begins on a battlefield. It doesn't open with the roar of engines or the crack of rifle fire. It begins in a filing cabinet, because that is where the German army actually died, not in some single catastrophic defeat, but in the slow, irreversible arithmetic of men consumed faster than men replaced. By the end of 1943, the Ostheer, the German army on the Eastern Front, had suffered approximately 3,900,000 casualties since the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Killed, wounded, missing, sick. The replacement army had fed back roughly 2,600,000. The deficit, 1,264,000 men, was not a temporary setback. It was structural. It was the kind of gap that doesn't close, because the pool of trained, physically fit, military-age men in Germany was not infinite. And every month, the gap widened. And every month, the war demanded more. The official reports kept arriving on desks in Zossen, each one a little worse than the last, each one carrying the quiet, bureaucratic weight of a nation consuming its own future. The system that was failing had once been elegant. Germany's replacement army, the Ersatz here, operated on a principle of territorial military districts called Wehrkreise, each responsible for recruiting, training, and dispatching replacements to specific divisions in the field. A soldier wounded on the Eastern Front would be evacuated, treated, and ideally returned to his original division through a Marschbataillon, a march battalion organized in the home district, loaded onto trains, and routed to the appropriate army group rear area. In 1940 and 41, this system worked with the mechanical efficiency the German military was famous for. A division that lost 500 men in a week could expect replacements within 2 to 3 weeks, often trained to a reasonable standard, often slotted into the same company they'd originally served in. Unit cohesion was maintained. Institutional knowledge survived. But by 1944, the system was breaking at every joint. The training cycle had been compressed, 16 weeks where 26 had once been standard, and the Marschbataillon were arriving at railheads that were being bombed, routes through networks that were increasingly disrupted, and delivering men who were younger, older, or less physically fit than their predecessors. The machinery was still turning, but what it produced was thinner, weaker, less capable. The numbers tell the story with a precision that no narrative can match. In December 1943, the monthly intake of replacements for the entire German army fell below 100,000 for the first time in the war. The monthly losses, meanwhile, exceeded 160,000. This wasn't a spike caused by a single battle. It was the new baseline. The war was eating men at a rate the nation simply could not sustain. And the response from the high command was not strategic retrenchment, but organizational improvisation that bordered on fantasy. In February 1944, Hitler ordered a series of comb-outs, directives to strip rear area units, headquarters staffs, and support organizations of any man who could carry a rifle, and send him to the front. The OKW War Diary, the daily record of the German Armed Forces High Command, claimed these comb-outs yielded 300,000 men. The replacement army's own internal audit, a less public and far less optimistic document, identified barely 120,000 as genuinely suitable for frontline service. The gap between those two figures, 300,000 claimed versus 120,000 real, is not a minor discrepancy. It is the sound of an institution lying to itself, and it echoes through every subsequent month of the war. What arrived at the front reflected this desperation. The 1926 class, boys who turned 18 in 1944, entered the replacement pipeline with abbreviated training, and in many cases, without having fired a full combat qualification course. Divisional records from the spring and summer of 1944 are peppered with complaints from frontline commanders about the quality of replacements. Men who didn't know how to maintain their weapons in field conditions, who hadn't trained with live grenades, who froze under artillery fire because no training ground in Pomerania or Bavaria could replicate the experience of high-explosive shells detonating within 50 meters of your position. But it got stranger than young men with insufficient training. The German army, by mid-1944, was fielding entire battalions organized around medical conditions. They were called Magenbataillon, stomach battalions, composed of soldiers with chronic gastric disorders who required special diets that the field kitchen system could not reliably provide. There were similar formations for men with ear conditions, men with limited mobility, men who, in any rational military system, would have been assigned to rear area duties or discharged entirely. They were holding sections of the front line. They were listed on the order of battle as infantry battalions, and they were expected to fight. When I was working through the Feldstarker reports for this chapter, cross-referencing the authorized strength figures against the actual returns division by division, I found it striking how clinical the language remained, even as the numbers became catastrophic. There's no panic in these documents, no exclamation marks. The red pencil arrow in the margin of that January report is the closest thing to an emotional response I found in hundreds of pages of personnel tables. The bureaucratic machinery of the German military continued to function. Forms were filled, reports were filed, statistics were compiled, even as the substance behind the forms hollowed out. It's a phenomenon I've encountered in other institutional collapses. The paperwork outlasts the reality. The replacement army kept producing Zustandsberichte, condition reports, rating divisions' combat value on a standardized scale, and the divisions kept checking the boxes, and the boxes kept getting less optimistic, and nobody stopped the process to say what the numbers already made obvious. The system was designed to report problems, not to solve the unsolvable. There's another dimension to this story that the personnel tables don't capture directly, but that hovers behind every figure. By late 1943, more than 400,000 Hilfswillige, willing helpers, universally abbreviated to Hiwis, were embedded in the German army's support structure on the Eastern Front alone. These were Soviet citizens, mostly prisoners of war, who had volunteered or been coerced into service as drivers, ammunition carriers, cooks, laborers, and in some cases, even auxiliary combatants. 400,000. That is roughly the strength of 30 infantry divisions, performing functions that German soldiers would otherwise have had to fill. The Wehrmacht was relying on the manpower of the enemy it was fighting to feed itself, transport its ammunition, and maintain its positions. To me, this is one of the most quietly astonishing facts of the war, not because it's unknown to specialists, but because it so completely undermines the popular image of the German army as a self-contained, nationally homogeneous fighting force. By 1944, it was nothing of the kind. It was a hybrid organism, dependent on foreign labor at every level below the combat units, and that dependency was itself a vulnerability that Soviet offensives would exploit. When the front collapsed, the Hiwis disappeared, fled, surrendered, or were killed, and the support structure collapsed with them. The consequences of this manpower crisis rippled outward in ways that the personnel tables could quantify but not fully explain. Divisions that should have been pulled out of the line for rest and reconstitution stayed in combat for months without relief, their strength eroding like a sandbar in a current. Battalions that had once fielded 600 men operated with 200, then 150, then were consolidated into Kampfgruppen, battle groups, that carried the name and number of a regiment but had the actual strength of a reinforced company. The organizational charts in the war diaries became increasingly fictional. A division, on the Eastern Front map, might represent 4,000 exhausted men, rather than the 12,500 the name implied. And the staff officers in Zossen knew it, and the field commanders knew it, and the only person who seemed not to know it, or refused to acknowledge it, was the one person whose orders could not be questioned. The Führerbefehl, the Führer's directive, continued to arrive at headquarters across Europe, demanding that positions be held, counterattacks be launched, and formations that existed only on paper perform miracles with resources they didn't have. The gap between the order and the reality was the space in which the German army died. The Feldpost letters, the military mail that connected the front to the home front, carry traces of this knowledge, filtered through censorship and self-censorship, but present nonetheless. Soldiers writing home in the spring of 1944 rarely expressed the confident tone of the 1941 letters. The language had shifted. Less talk of victory, more talk of endurance, of doing one's duty, of hoping the war would end somehow. The military censorship apparatus, the Feldpostprüfstellen, sampled roughly 2 to 5% of all outgoing mail and compiled mood summaries, Stimmungsberichte, for higher command. These summaries, where they survive, paint a picture of an army that had not yet broken, but had stopped believing. The distinction matters. An army that has stopped believing can still fight. Institutional discipline, unit cohesion, fear of punishment, and sheer habit can sustain combat effectiveness long after hope is gone. But an army that has stopped believing is brittle in a way that no personnel table can measure. When the blow comes, and the blow was coming, it shatters rather than bends. So here is the question that this chapter poses, and that the remaining 16 must answer. If the arithmetic was already lethal by January of 1944, if the replacement system was failing, if the divisions were hollowed out, if the soldiers had stopped believing, why did it take another 16 months for the German army to collapse? What sustained an institution past the mathematical point of its own destruction? The answer is not simple, and it is not flattering to anyone. It involves organizational resilience and institutional terror in roughly equal measure. It involves the Allied supply failures that gave the Germans breathing room they shouldn't have had. It involves the Ardennes offensive that consumed the last reserves in a strategic fantasy. And it involves, at the very end, an army that turned its violence inward, executing its own soldiers at a rate that dwarfed anything in its earlier history, because the machinery of coercion outlasted the machinery of combat. But all of that is ahead. For now, we are still in Desertion, still looking at the red pencil arrow, still watching a clerk perform the arithmetic of an army's extinction. The ventilation fan hums, the coffee is cold, the numbers don't lie, and nobody in the room can say so out loud. Chapter 2. The Backbone Shatters. Underground. The 12th of May, 1944, a Tuesday. Over central Germany, the sky is full of aircraft, 935 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers of the United States 8th Air Force, flying in formations that stretch across miles of airspace, bound for targets most of their crews have never heard of: Luna, Bolin, Zeitz, Brooks, Lutzkendorf. The names mean nothing to the average American bombardier hunched over his Norden bomb site in the cold at 25,000 feet. But they mean everything to a small group of Allied planners who have spent months arguing, bitterly at times, about what, exactly, strategic bombing should destroy. Today's mission is the first large-scale American attack on Germany's synthetic fuel industry. In a post-war interrogation room, a year from now, a German official named Edmund Geilenberg will be asked when he knew the war was lost. The typist will record his answer as August 1944. Geilenberg will cross out the typed date and write, in ink, pressing hard, a different answer. The 12th of May, 1944. Today. The argument that preceded this mission was one of the most consequential internal debates of the Allied war effort, and it played out not on any battlefield, but in conference rooms in London and at Supreme Headquarters. On one side stood General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, who believed that the key to German collapse lay in destroying the enemy's fuel supply, specifically the synthetic fuel plants that produce the majority of Germany's aviation gasoline and a significant share of its motor fuel. On the other side stood Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder and his scientific advisor Solly Zuckerman, who argued that the priority should be the French and Belgian rail network, the transportation plan, to isolate the Normandy battlefield ahead of D-Day. Both sides had data. Both sides had logic, and both sides were, in their own way, right. The transportation plan would help win the Battle of Normandy. The oil campaign would help win the war. The debate consumed weeks of precious pre-invasion planning time, generated reams of memoranda, many of which survive in the Public Record Office's AIR 37 series, and was ultimately resolved by Eisenhower's decision to pursue both, sequentially. Transportation first, then oil. But the fuel campaign, once unleashed, proved to be the single most effective application of strategic air power in the European war. The reason lies in chemistry and engineering. Germany's fuel problem was unlike any other industrial vulnerability because it was rooted in geology. The Reich sat on massive coal deposits, but had virtually no domestic petroleum. The pre-war solution had been to develop synthetic fuel technology, two processes primarily. The Burgess hydrogenation process subjected coal to extreme heat and pressure in the presence of hydrogen to produce liquid fuel. The Fischer-Tropsch process converted coal-derived synthesis gas into hydrocarbons through catalytic reactions. Both processes required enormous, complex industrial plants. Luna, the largest, covered several square kilometers, filled with high-pressure vessels, miles of pipe networks, distillation columns, and catalyst beds that operated under conditions of extraordinary temperature and pressure. These plants were engineering marvels. They were also extraordinarily fragile. A conventional oil refinery, if bombed, could often be repaired by patching pipes and replacing standard components. A hydrogenation plant operated at pressures exceeding 200 atmospheres. A single bomb strike on a high-pressure vessel or its associated piping didn't just create a hole, it created a cascading failure that could take weeks or months to repair, requiring specialized alloys, custom-fabricated components, and engineering expertise that was itself in short supply. The numbers from the spring and summer of 1944 track the destruction with an almost clinical precision that comes directly from Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments. Speer's technocrats, whatever else might be said about them, were meticulous record keepers, and their internal chronic reports document the cascade in real time. In April 1944, total German synthetic fuel production stood at approximately 348,000 metric tons. After the May 12th attacks and the sustained campaign that followed, production began a descent that the Germans fought with genuine ingenuity, but could not reverse. By June, it had dropped significantly. By September, German aviation fuel production, the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe, had fallen from 175,000 tons in April to 17,000 tons. From 175,000 to 17,000, a 90% reduction in 5 months. When I first encountered this specific figure in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey data, I had to recheck it against the Speer Ministry records, because it seemed too dramatic to be accurate. It wasn't. It was the reality, and its consequences were absolute. The most immediate and measurable consequence was in the air. The Luftwaffe's pilot training program, already compressed by attrition and fuel shortages earlier in the war, collapsed. By late 1944, a German student pilot received approximately 15 flight hours of training before being sent to an operational unit. 15 hours. His Allied counterpart received over 200. This is not a marginal difference. It is the difference between a pilot who can take off, navigate, and land, and a pilot who can actually fight. The fuel shortage didn't just ground the Luftwaffe's existing squadrons, though it did that too. It destroyed the pipeline of future pilots, ensuring that even if aircraft production continued, and under Speer's dispersal program, it actually increased in 1944, there would be no one qualified to fly them. The aircraft sat in forest clearings and improvised airfields, camouflaged under netting, waiting for fuel that didn't come and pilots who couldn't fly. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe was functionally absent from most battlefields. The German army fought the last 8 months of the war under skies owned entirely by the enemy. But fuel was only half of the strategic bombing story, and I want to dwell on the other half because it receives less attention and matters just as much. The transportation campaign, the systematic destruction of the German rail network, didn't just isolate Normandy before D-Day. It progressively paralyzed the entire circulatory system of the German war economy. The Reichsbahn, Germany's national railway, was the connective tissue that linked coal mines to factories, factories to ammunition depots, depots to railheads, and railheads to the front. When Allied bombers destroyed marshalling yards, Ham, the largest in Europe, was hit repeatedly. They didn't just delay individual trains. They created bottlenecks that cascaded through the entire network. Trains backed up behind destroyed junctions. Coal couldn't move from the Ruhr to the synthetic fuel plants, which meant the fuel plants couldn't operate even when repaired. Ammunition produced in Thuringia couldn't reach divisions in France. The Reichsbahn's daily situation reports, Tagesberichte, from the autumn of 1944, read like dispatches from a patient in progressive organ failure. Each destroyed junction created pressure on alternative routes, which became congested, which made them better targets, which led to their destruction, which created more pressure elsewhere. The system didn't collapse all at once. It strangled, slowly, junction by junction, bridge by bridge, until the army at the front was disconnected from the nation behind it. What fascinates me most about this story, and I say this having spent weeks in the bombing survey records, is the German response. It wasn't passivity. Edmund Geilenberg, appointed to lead the emergency fuel plant repair program, organized a workforce of tens of thousands, including, it must be said, concentration camp laborers, to repair damaged plants as fast as the Allies could bomb them. And he had real success. Plants that were knocked out would be partially restored within weeks, sometimes producing at 30 or 40% capacity before being hit again. The Allied victory in the fuel war was not a single knockout blow, but a war of exhaustion against the repair crews. Each raid forced a repair cycle. Each repair cycle consumed materials, specialized labor, and time. Each subsequent raid arrived a little sooner, because Allied intelligence was learning the rhythm of German repair and timing its attacks to catch plants just as they restarted production. The cumulative effect was not just reduced output, it was the physical and organizational exhaustion of the people trying to keep the system alive. By January 1945, even Geilenberg's program had reached its limits. The The repair workforce was depleted. The specialized components were gone. The coal couldn't reach the plants couldn't produce the fuel couldn't reach the front. The connection between the strategic bombing campaign and the destruction of the German army on the ground is not abstract. It is mechanical, traceable through specific supply chains and specific consequences. When aviation fuel disappeared, the Luftwaffe couldn't fly. When the Luftwaffe couldn't fly, German artillery lost its aerial observation capability, the eyes that directed its fire. When German artillery went blind, the most lethal arm of the Wehrmacht, the one that had inflicted more Allied casualties than any other, was reduced to firing on pre-registered defensive targets and guesswork. When motor fuel ran short, panzer divisions couldn't maneuver. Tanks that couldn't move became fixed defensive positions, dangerous, certainly, but incapable of the mobile counterattacks that had been the German army's tactical signature since 1939. When the rail network fractured, ammunition couldn't reach the front in sufficient quantities, and divisions that had once fired thousands of shells per day were rationed to hundreds, then dozens. Each of these degradations was manageable in isolation. Together, they were fatal. The German army didn't run out of soldiers or weapons first. It ran out of the ability to move, see, and shoot. The Speer Ministry's final fuel production figures carry the weight of this story in a single data series. April 1944, 348,000 metric tons. September 1944, 17,000 tons of aviation fuel. March 1945, total synthetic fuel production across all types, 22,000 metric tons. That last figure, 22,000, represented a 94% reduction from the April peak. It meant that the entire German war machine, from the Eastern Front to the Western Front to the defense of the Reich itself, was operating on roughly 6% of its mid-war fuel capacity. Tanks were towed to their defensive positions by horses or tractors to save fuel. Pilot training was conducted in gliders. Transport columns moved at night to avoid air attack and ran dry on roads that led nowhere because the next fuel dump was empty. The great industrial war machine that had conquered most of Europe was, by the spring of 1945, a mechanism running on fumes in every sense of the word. There is a final detail from the bombing survey records that I want to leave the listener with, because it captures something the statistics alone cannot. In the post-war interrogations, multiple German officials and officers were asked the same question. When did you know the war was lost? The answers varied. Some said Stalingrad, some said D-Day, some said the Ardennes failure. But the officials responsible for fuel production were nearly unanimous, and their answer was always some date in the spring or summer of 1944. Geilenberg said the 12th of May. Others pointed to dates in June or July. What they shared was a technician's clarity. They understood the numbers, they understood the chemistry, and they understood that no amount of tactical brilliance on the battlefield could compensate for an army that couldn't fuel its vehicles or arm its guns. The bombers at 25,000 feet couldn't see the consequences of their work. The men on the ground couldn't see the bombers' strategy. But the clerks and engineers in between, the men who tracked the production curves and the rail throughput figures, could see both. And what they saw was an ending. The lights in the Speer Ministry burned late into the night, and the reports kept coming, and the numbers kept falling. And the war ground on for months past the point anyone in those offices believed it could be won. The machinery of reporting outlasted the machinery of production, just as the paperwork in Zossen outlasted the soldiers it counted. That is how systems die. Not with a bang, but with a final entry in a ledger that no one reads. Chapter 3. The Diary and the Ditch. A spring day in 1944. Somewhere on the Central Eastern Front, the precise location censored, both then and now, an infantry Unteroffizier sits in a dugout writing a letter to his wife. The dugout smells of earth, sweat, and the particular chemical odor of S-bit fuel tablets used to heat rations. The paper is thin, wartime quality, and the pencil needs sharpening, but he writes carefully, in the small, controlled hand of a man who has learned to conserve everything, including graphite. The military censor will read this letter, or might read it. Roughly 1 in 20 to 1 in 50 letters were opened by the Feldpost Prüfstellen, the postal censorship offices. The censor will black out any place name. The soldier knows this. So instead of writing where he is, he draws something in the margin. A tiny Orthodox church dome. Not a word of explanation, just the dome, no bigger than a thumbprint, enough for his wife to find the town on a map. The censor misses it. The letter survives in the collections of the Museum Stiftung Post und Telekommunikation, and that small sketch, an act of quiet defiance against his own side's information controls, is, to my eye, one of the most human artifacts of the entire war. Before we break the German army at the operational level, before Bagration and Normandy and the great encirclements that fill the later chapters of this story, we need to pause and understand who was in it. Not the generals, not the staff officers, not the planners in Zossen, whose arithmetic we've already examined, but the men in the dugouts, the Lanzer, the common soldier. By the spring of 1944, the average German infantryman on the Eastern Front was a paradox, simultaneously more experienced than almost any soldier on any other front, and more exhausted than any personnel report could capture. Many of the men still serving in frontline divisions had been in continuous or near-continuous combat for 2 or 3 years. They knew things about fieldcraft, survival, and small unit tactics that no training program could teach. How to read the sound of incoming artillery to judge caliber and distance. How to dig a sleeping position in frozen ground, using a bayonet and a helmet. How to rotate sentry duty in a company reduced to 40% strength so that someone, somewhere, was always awake. This knowledge was institutional gold. It was also being spent faster than it was replaced, because every week, experienced men were killed, wounded, or evacuated, and the replacements who arrived to fill their positions came with 16 weeks of training, and, in the words of one surviving diary, eyes that hadn't seen anything yet. The Feldpost system, the military mail, was the emotional infrastructure that held this army together, and its sheer scale tells you something about the war's human dimensions that casualty figures cannot. Between 1939 and 1945, the German military postal system handled approximately 3,900,000,000 individual items of mail, letters, postcards, small parcels. In 1944 alone, roughly 1,200,000,000 pieces of mail moved between the front and the home front. 1,200,000,000. That is the volume of a nation in conversation with its army, and the conversation ran in both directions. Soldiers wrote home about rations, weather, boredom, and the carefully unspecified events that censorship prevented them from describing directly. Families wrote back about children's school reports, the neighbor's bombed-out house, the difficulty of getting shoes repaired. The system's average transit time was 6 to 10 days from the Eastern Front to Germany, longer from Italy and the occupation zones. It was, in its way, a marvel of logistics. Dedicated Feldpost units, specialized sorting centers, reserved rail capacity, and it functioned far longer than many other German military systems. But the gap between official performance and individual experience was real. The Feldpost records claim delivery rates above 90% well into 1944. Multiple soldier diaries complain of letters lost for weeks or never arriving at all, especially after Soviet offensives disrupted the rear area postal sorting stations that served as the system's nodes. The institution measured its own success. The soldiers measured their own disappointment. What the soldiers actually wrote, when read in volume, reveals a shift in psychological register that the official Stimmungsberichte, the mood reports compiled by censorship offices, and the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS security service, captured only partially. The language of the early war years, confident, often ideologically inflected, full of references to duty and destiny, had given way by 1944 to something more guarded, more formulaic, more focused on the immediate and the personal. Men wrote about food. They wrote about sleep. They wrote about hoping the war would end, using phrasing careful enough to pass the censor, but transparent enough for their families to understand. "I hope we'll all be home soon," became a near-universal closing line, replacing the earlier Sieg Heil or Heil Hitler sign-offs that had been common in 41 and 42. This shift wasn't universal. Some soldiers remained committed, some were simply less reflective, but the aggregate trend, visible across thousands of surviving letters, points in one direction. The army hadn't mutinied, it hadn't stopped fighting, but it had stopped believing in the stated purpose of the fight, and was continuing for reasons that had more to do with loyalty to immediate comrades, fear of consequences, and the sheer momentum of institutional routine than with any conviction that victory was possible. The censorship apparatus itself was a system of considerable sophistication and unintentional irony. The Feldpostprüfstellen operated in each Wehrkreis and at army level, sampling between 2 and 5% of outgoing mail. Censors, often older soldiers or women auxiliary workers, opened letters, read them, blacked out prohibited content, place names, unit designations, operational details, defeatist statements, and compiled periodic Stimmungsberichte summarizing the mood of the troops. These summaries were forwarded up the chain of command, where they were read, acknowledged, and largely ignored. The irony is double. First, the censorship system provided the high command with genuine intelligence about the Army's psychological state, intelligence that the command structure was institutionally incapable of acting on, because the only rational response, ending the war, was politically impossible. Second, the soldiers themselves developed methods to circumvent the censorship, creating a shadow communication system within the official one. Families developed private codes, underlined words whose first letters spelled out messages, oblique references to shared memories that carried meanings invisible to an outsider, the tiny church dome in the margin. An army's own communication system was being subverted by its own men, not for espionage or sabotage, but simply to tell the truth to the people they loved. When I chose to anchor this chapter on a single letter, a single sketch and a margin, I did so knowing that the rest of this series will be dominated by operational maps, tonnage figures, and divisional strength returns. It fascinates me how the smallest artifacts often carry the most interpretive weight. A field strength report tells you how many men are listed in a division. A letter tells you who one of those men was. The church dome tells you he was paying attention to the world around him, noticing the architecture of the towns he passed through, and that he wanted his wife to know where he was, even at the risk of his letter being seized and himself being disciplined for a security violation. The risk was real. Soldiers caught deliberately encoding information in their letters could face punishment, though enforcement was inconsistent. This man chose the risk. He chose a tiny, personal act of communication over the rules of the institution that controlled his life, his movement, and potentially his death. I don't know his name. The letter in the museum collection is cataloged by date and Feldpost number, not by identity. He is, to me, the German army's everyman, competent, tired, quietly defiant, and trapped in a system whose trajectory he could probably sense but could not influence. The arrival of replacements, the connection between the arithmetic of Chapter 1 and the human reality of the front line, generated some of the most revealing diary entries of the war's middle period. One surviving account, from a veteran Feldwebel in an infantry company, describes the arrival of a batch of replacements in the spring of 1944 with a precision that is almost clinical, but not quite cold enough to be emotionless. The new men were young. Several were 17, having been called up from the 1926 birth year class. They carried their equipment incorrectly. They had never fired their weapons at anything that fired back. They looked at the veterans, men who were often only 23 or 24 themselves, but who had aged beyond their years, with a mixture of awe and fear. The Feldwebel's diary doesn't editorialize. He notes the replacement's arrival, assigns them to squads, and records that one was sent back the same day because he was physically unable to carry a full infantry load over the distances required. The tone is weary professionalism, but the entries over the following weeks track the new men's progress and the casualties among them, with an attention that suggests something more than administrative record-keeping. He was watching boys learn to become soldiers in an army that no longer had time to teach them properly, and he was writing it down, because writing it down was the only thing he could do about it. The Stimmungsberichte, compiled by the Sicherheitsdienst on the home front, offer a mirror image of the soldiers' letters. Same anxiety, different vantage point. By 1944, the SD's domestic intelligence reports documented a population that was weary, skeptical of official optimism, and increasingly preoccupied with the bombing campaign's impact on daily life. The Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, propaganda still generated flickers of hope, but the SD's own analysts noted that each postponement of the promised decisive weapon eroded credibility further. The reports are surprisingly candid in places. The SD's function was to report accurately to the leadership, even when the news was unwelcome, and they paint a picture of a society that had not yet cracked, but had developed a thick shell of private cynicism beneath a surface of public compliance. People said the right things in public and different things at home. They listened to the BBC, a criminal offense, and passed along rumors about German losses that were often more accurate than the official communiques. The gap between public and private discourse widened monthly, and the Feldpost letters from the front, read in this context, were not just personal communications. They were threads connecting two populations of people who increasingly knew the truth and increasingly could not say it. The war diary of a German infantry company in the spring of 1944, if we could reconstruct its daily rhythm from the surviving records, would look something like this: 0530 hours. Stand 2. The dawn routine when the entire position manned its defensive posts against possible attack. 0600. Stand down if no contact. 0630. Morgenmeldung, the morning report. Telephone to battalion. Personnel present. Ammunition state. Any activity overnight. 0700. Essensholung, the ration-carrying party sent back to the field kitchen, returning with bread, sausage, ersatz coffee, and whatever the cook had improvised from the ration issue. The rest of the morning: maintenance of positions, sentry rotation, equipment cleaning. Afternoon: sleep for those not on duty, if the artillery allowed it. Evening: another stand to at dusk. Night: sentry duty and 2-hour rotations, listening to the darkness, waiting for the patrol or the bombardment that might or might not come. This was the rhythm of the static front, not heroic, not dramatic, just the grinding routine of men holding a piece of earth because they'd been told to hold it, filling their days with the small logistical tasks of survival. It is almost peaceful in the diary entries, almost boring. The violence, when it came, arrived suddenly, and was recorded in the same flat tone as the morning ration report. A man's death warranted the same number of words as the weather. This is the last quiet chapter. The men in these dugouts, writing these letters, drawing tiny church domes and margins, don't know it yet, though some of them probably suspect it, but the catastrophe of Operation Bagration is weeks away. The Soviet summer offensive will destroy the army group that many of them serve in. The carefully maintained routines of morning reports and ration runs and sentry rotations will be swept away in a matter of days, replaced by the chaos of encirclement, retreat, and mass surrender. The letters will stop. The Feldpost sorting stations will be overrun. The chain that connected these men to their families will be severed, in many cases permanently. I chose to linger here, on one letter, one sketch, one soldier in a dugout, because the numbers in the chapters ahead are so large that they can anesthetize. 399,000 casualties, 28 divisions destroyed. The figures are accurate, and they are important, and they are also, in a fundamental sense, abstractions. This man with his pencil and his church dome is not an abstraction. He is one of the 399,000, or one of the men who survived, and either way, his war is about to change in ways that no diary entry could prepare him for. The pencil marks in the margin are still there, in a museum case, still legible. The dugout is long gone. The church, probably rebuilt. The silence after the letter was finished, the silence of a man folding paper, sealing an envelope, writing an address he'd written 100 times. That silence sits just beneath the surface of every operational history that follows, if you know to listen for it. Chapter 4. Bagration. The Earth Opens. The 22nd of June, 1944, the third anniversary to the day of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. This is not a coincidence. Stalin chose the date. Along the vast front lines stretching through Belorussia, the swampy, forested no-man's land between Moscow and Warsaw, the night is warm and restless. In the German positions of Army Group Center, the troops are on routine alert. They have been here for months. Their defensive positions are well constructed, deep trenches, bunkers, overlapping fields of fire. They are also, by the standards we established in Chapter 1, desperately under strength. But the officers at Army Group Center headquarters are not panicked. Their intelligence assessment points south, toward Ukraine, where the Soviets have been massing with conspicuous visibility. Tanks spotted by aerial reconnaissance. Radio traffic intercepted and analyzed. Supply dumps identified. The buildup opposite Army Group Center is, by comparison, unremarkable. The Soviets appear to be doing very little in Belorussia, which is exactly what 370 dummy tanks, fake radio networks, and the most sophisticated deception operation of the entire war are designed to make them believe. The operation that was about to unfold, codenamed Bagration, after the Georgian prince who fought Napoleon, is, by almost any quantitative measure, the most devastating single blow struck against the German army in the Second World War. More destructive than Stalingrad in its total casualty count, more geographically sweeping in its results. And yet, in the English-speaking world, it remains far less known than D-Day, which occurred 17 days earlier and dominates the popular memory of the summer of 1944. This imbalance is itself a historiographical problem worth flagging. The Western Allies' contribution to Germany's defeat was enormous and is well documented, but the operation that actually destroyed the largest single German formation, Army Group Center, happened on the Eastern Front, and its relative obscurity in Western public consciousness reflects the Cold War's distortion of Second World War memory, rather than any objective assessment of military significance. When I made the editorial decision to place Bagration as this series' first major operational chapter, ahead of the Normandy breakout, I did so deliberately, knowing that some listeners would expect D-Day to come first. My judgment is that Bagration was the more consequential blow to the German army as a fighting force. Not all historians agree, and the debate is legitimate, but the numbers are on my side. The Maskirovka, the Soviet deception plan, was a masterwork of operational art that exploited the German command's own assumptions. The Soviet General Staff, the Stavka, understood that the Germans expected the main summer offensive to come in Ukraine. The logic was sound, because Ukraine offered the shortest route to the Balkans and the Romanian oil fields. Rather than correcting this assumption, the Soviets reinforced it. In the weeks before Bagration, they created an elaborate false buildup opposite Army Group North Ukraine. Dummy tank concentrations, increased radio traffic generated by dedicated signals units, simulated supply movements, and deliberate intelligence leaks, designed to be intercepted by German signals intelligence. Meanwhile, the real buildup in Belorussia was conducted with extraordinary discipline. Troop movements occurred only at night. Radio silence was enforced with a rigor that modern military communications officers would find almost unimaginable. Camouflage netting was consumed in quantities that the logistical records describe in tons, rather than square meters. The result was the assembly of over 1,600,000 Soviet troops, approximately 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 31,000 artillery pieces and heavy mortars, all concentrated against Army Group Center's roughly 800,000 men, largely undetected. The margin note in the deception plan's appendix, 370 mock-ups, already ready, captures the planning horizon. The fake army was ready before the real one was in position. The night before the main offensive, something happened that has no precise equivalent in Western military experience. On the night of the 19th to the 20th of June, Belarusian partisans, coordinating with the Soviet military command through the BSSR partisan staff, conducted more than 10,000 individual demolitions against the German rail network behind Army Group Center. 10,000. In a single night. Railway lines were cut in so many places simultaneously that the German logistics system behind the front was paralyzed before the first Soviet artillery shell had been fired. This was not random sabotage. It was a synchronized operation, timed to prevent the movement of reserves to the front during the critical first 48 hours of the offensive. The German Fourth Army's war diary attributes the subsequent supply breakdown primarily to the partisan demolitions. Soviet sources give more credit to preliminary airstrikes. Both accounts are partially self-serving. The partisans and the Air Force were different branches with different institutional interests, and the truth is almost certainly a synergy that neither source fully acknowledges. What matters is the effect. By dawn on the 23rd of June, when the main Soviet artillery preparation began, Army Group Center's ability to move reserves by rail was already crippled. The artillery preparation itself defies easy comprehension. Across the multiple breakthrough sectors, Soviet guns achieved densities of over 200 pieces per kilometer of frontage. In the main attack zones, the preparation lasted hours, a systematic sequence of destruction fire aimed at identified positions, followed by suppression fire timed to the infantry assault, followed by the Ognevoi Val, the fire shaft, a moving curtain of explosions that advanced ahead of the infantry at a precisely calibrated rate, 100 meters every 2 to 4 minutes. If the infantry kept pace, they arrived at each German position moments after the artillery had passed over it, finding defenders who were stunned, buried, or dead. If they fell behind, they walked into their own fire. If the fire shaft moved too fast, the Germans had time to recover and man their weapons. The coordination required, across hundreds of batteries, multiple divisions, with communication conducted by field telephone and signal flag as much as by radio, was a mathematical and organizational achievement that reflected 3 years of brutal learning on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Army of June 1944 was not the Army of June 1941. It had been rebuilt from catastrophe, retrained, re-equipped, and it had learned operational art at a cost in lives that beggars description. Bagration was the examination, and the Soviet forces passed it. The German collapse, when it came, was faster and more total than anything the Eastern Front had seen since 1941. But this time, the roles were reversed. Within the first week, the Soviets had encircled German forces at Vitebsk and Bobruisk, trapping corps-sized formations in pockets that had no hope of relief. The 35th Corps, the 12th Corps, the 53rd Corps, units that represented tens of thousands of trained soldiers, were surrounded, ground down, and destroyed. The unit war diaries tell the story in their own particular way. Entries become shorter, more fragmented, more desperate, and then simply stop. The 78th Sturm Division's war diary has its final entry on the 25th of June, 3 days into the offensive. After that, silence. The division ceased to exist as a reportable entity. Its men were dead, captured, or scattered in small groups trying to filter eastward through Soviet lines. When I encounter these terminal diary entries in the archives, they have a quality that is different from any other type of military record. An after-action report is written with hindsight. A memoir is written with purpose. A war diary that stops mid-sentence is written by someone who ran out of time. By the first week of July, the scale of the disaster was clear, and it was worse than Stalingrad. Minsk, the capital of Belarusia and the major logistics hub behind Army Group Center, fell on the 3rd of July. The remnants of multiple German corps were trapped east of the city. General Lieutenant Vincenz Müller, commanding the 12th Corps, made a decision on the 8th of July that placed him on the wrong side of German military honor and the right side of his men's survival. He surrendered the remnants of his command to the Soviets. The decision was not explicitly ordered by higher authority. It was Müller's own judgment that further resistance would only add to the body count without changing the outcome. He would later become a founding officer of East Germany's military, a trajectory that tells you something about the post-war world's capacity for reinvention. His Soviet interrogation protocols survive, and they reveal a man who was exhausted, realistic, and, by the standards of the German officer corps, remarkably candid about the operational failures that had led to the catastrophe. 9 days after Müller's surrender, on the 17th of July, the Soviets staged a piece of theater that was as much strategic communication as humiliation. 57,000 German prisoners of war were marched through the streets of Moscow. The newsreel footage survives, long columns of gray-clad men, hollow-eyed and filthy, walking past Soviet citizens who watched in silence or contempt. The NKVD logistics planning for the march, how to move 57,000 men through a city, how to water and guard them, how to position cameras for maximum propaganda effect, was itself a significant organizational task, documented in internal Soviet security files. The total losses of Army Group Center and Bagration defy compression into a single sentence, but the attempt must be made. In approximately 6 weeks, from the 23rd of June to early August 1944, Army Group Center suffered roughly 399,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and captured. 31 generals were lost, 10 killed, and 21 captured. 28 divisions were effectively destroyed, meaning they ceased to function as combat formations and could not be reconstituted without being rebuilt from scratch. The authorized strength of Army Group Center on the 22nd of June had been approximately 850,000 men. Nearly half of that force ceased to exist as a fighting entity within a month. To put this in comparative context, the entire Stalingrad encirclement, which dominates Western popular imagination as the signature German catastrophe of the war, resulted in the loss of approximately 330,000 men of the 6th Army. Bagration exceeded Stalingrad by a margin of nearly 70,000 casualties, and destroyed more than twice as many divisions. The fact that Stalingrad is universally known, and Bagration is not, is itself a statement about how historical memory is constructed, and by whom. The specific mechanism of the disaster was not merely Soviet numerical superiority, though that was overwhelming. It was Hitler's Festerplatz order, the directive requiring certain cities and towns to be designated as fortified places and held to the last man, regardless of the tactical situation. Vitebsk was declared a Festerplatz, so was Bobruisk. The order meant that when the Soviet pincers swung around these positions, the German garrisons couldn't withdraw. They were under explicit orders to hold, and disobedience meant court-martial and execution. The policy that was designed to prevent a repetition of the retreats of the winter of 43 to 44, to anchor the front on strong points that the Soviets would have to reduce, instead created the cauldrons that consumed the army. Divisions that might have conducted fighting withdrawals, trading space for time and preserving their combat strength for a new defensive line further west, were instead pinned in place and destroyed. The Festerplatz concept is one of those command decisions that reveals the fatal flaw at the heart of the German war effort, the strategic direction of the army by a man whose authority could not be questioned, whose military judgment was increasingly detached from operational reality, and whose response to every setback was to forbid retreat, which guaranteed that the next setback would be worse. There is a question that this chapter must pose honestly before it closes, because the answer is not straightforward and will take several more chapters to fully develop. If Army Group Center was annihilated, if 399,000 men were lost, and 28 divisions destroyed, why didn't the Soviet advance continue straight to Berlin in the summer of 1944? The front line moved roughly 600 kilometers westward in 6 weeks. The Soviets reached the outskirts of Warsaw by August, but then the advance slowed, stalled, and stopped. The reasons are multiple and debated. Soviet supply lines were now stretched across the same devastated Belarusian landscape they'd just liberated. Bridges blown, roads churned to mud, railroads on a different gauge that needed to be converted. Soviet tank armies had outrun their infantry support and were vulnerable to counterattack on their extended flanks. Political considerations, the Warsaw Uprising and Stalin's decision not to support it, played a role in the halt before the Polish capital. And the Germans, even in catastrophe, still possessed the institutional ability to scrape together blocking forces from remnants, training units, and rear area personnel, a capacity for improvisation that bought weeks of time. The advance would resume, eventually, but the pause gave the German army something it desperately needed and did not deserve: time. And what the Germans did with that time, the frantic reconstitution described in Chapter 10, the impossible Ardennes Gamble of Chapter 12, would determine whether the war lasted weeks or months longer. The Soviet guns fall silent, for now. The Belarusian summer fades toward autumn, and somewhere in the wreckage of Army Group Center, a war diary lies in a ditch, its final entry dated the 25th of June, its remaining pages blank. Chapter 5. The Ledger. Chapter. What an infantry division actually was. A morning in late May 1944, somewhere in Normandy, the exact location classified, the exact date a matter of routine, a German staff officer sits in a requisition farmhouse and fills out a pre-printed form. The form is a Zustandsbericht, a condition report, and it asks him to rate his division's Kampfwert, its combat value, by checking one of several boxes. Voll angriffsfähig, fully capable of offensive action. Bedingt angriffsfähig, conditionally capable. Voll verteidigungsfähig, fully capable of defensive action. Bedingt verteidigungsfähig, conditionally defensive. And so on, down a descending scale that no one wants to reach the bottom of. The officer checks bedingt angriffsfähig, conditionally capable of offensive action. The division is the 352nd Infantry Division, and in a few weeks it will face the American assault at Omaha Beach and become one of the most referenced formations in Western histories of the war. Dozens of books will describe its defense of the bluffs, but very few will mention this checkbox, this quiet institutional admission that the division was not at full strength, not fully ready, not the fortress that the popular narrative requires. A checked box on a carbon copy form, stamped and filed, is the kind of institutional honesty that memoirs rarely preserve. This chapter is different from the ones before and after it. It is not a battle. It is not a crisis. It is a technical manual. a deliberate pause to explain what a German infantry division actually was in 1944, because you cannot understand how the Allies broke the German army unless you understand the specific machine they were breaking. The popular imagination tends to picture a division as a mass of soldiers, vaguely organized, pointed in a general direction. The reality was an intricate combined arms organism of approximately 12,500 men on paper, though in practice, as that checkbox admits, usually 8,000 to 10,000, organized into interlocking functional components whose interaction determined combat power far more than the courage or skill of any individual soldier. The 352nd will serve as our specimen, not because it was typical, no division ever is, but because it is the division most Western listeners will encounter in other accounts of the war. And understanding its internal structure reframes the Omaha Beach story in ways that the standard heroic narrative misses entirely. A 1944-type German infantry division, per the Kriegsstarke Nachweisung, the War Establishment Tables, universally abbreviated to KSTN, held in the Bundesarchives RHD-18 series, was built around 3 grenadier regiments, each of roughly 3,000 men organized into 3 battalions. These regiments were the division's core: the riflemen, the machine gunners, the mortar crews who held the line and conducted attacks. Support them was an artillery regiment with a paper strength of 36 howitzers, a mix of the 10.5-centimeter Leff 18 light field howitzer and the 15-centimeter SFH 18 heavy howitzer, organized into 3 light battalions and 1 heavy battalion. The artillery was the division's killing arm, responsible for more enemy casualties than all the rifles and machine guns combined, a fact that infantry-centric narratives routinely understate. Beyond these primary components, the division contained a Fusilier battalion for reconnaissance, a Panzerjäger company equipped with towed or self-propelled anti-tank guns, a pioneer battalion of combat engineers capable of bridging, demolition, and mine clearance, a Nachrichten battalion handling signals and communications, and the sprawling logistical tail, the supply columns, the bakery company, the butchery platoon, the veterinary company, the field post office, and the military police detachment. Each component depended on the others. Remove the signals battalion, and the artillery couldn't receive fire missions. Remove the supply columns, and the infantry ran out of ammunition within hours. The division was a system, and like all systems, it failed at its weakest joint. The gap between the KSTN authorization and the 352nd's actual state in May 1944 illustrates the chasm between organizational theory and operational reality that defined the German army in its final year. The division's own reports to 84th Corps claimed approximately 12,000 men present for duty. The replacement army's records for the Marche Bataillon dispatched to the division suggest the true figure could not have exceeded 11,000, including the Hiwis, the Soviet and Eastern European auxiliary volunteers who performed support tasks. The discrepancy, 12,000 claimed versus 11,000 documented, is not dramatic, but it matters because it reveals a systemic issue. Different reporting formats included or excluded attached units, auxiliary personnel, and temporarily assigned specialists, making it genuinely difficult for higher headquarters to know the actual strength of the formations under their command. This is not a trivial archival problem. When the Corps commander assessed whether the 352nd could hold its sector, he was working with a number that was probably 10% too high. And that 10% margin might represent the difference between a division that could hold and one that could hold, barely, with no reserve. The horse is the forgotten protagonist of the German infantry division, and its absence from popular accounts borders on historical negligence. A 1944 German infantry division required approximately 4,500 horses, not for cavalry charges, those were a generation past, but for transport. The artillery pieces were horse-drawn, the supply wagons were horse-drawn, the ammunition columns, the kitchen wagons, the signals cable-laying carts, all moved on 4 legs and iron shoes over French mud and Russian snow. The German Army of the Second World War was, at its infantry corps, a 19th-century transport system carrying 20th-century weapons, and the implications were enormous. Horses needed forage, roughly 12 kilograms of feed per animal per day, plus water, creating a logistical burden that doesn't appear in most operational analyses, but consumed a significant fraction of the division's supply capacity. Horses died. They died from artillery fire, from exhaustion, from disease, from the cold, and the remount service, the organization responsible for replacing them, was failing by 1944, just as the personnel replacement system was failing. Veterinary reports from divisions in France show horses being worked beyond safe limits, replaced with captured French agricultural horses, unsuited to military loads, or supplemented with a heterogeneous collection of civilian vehicles, bicycles, and handcarts. The 352nd, positioned in static defensive positions in Normandy, was less affected by the horse crisis than Eastern Front divisions, but even its records note shortages in the supply train that constrain the forward movement of ammunition. I'll confess to finding the KSTN tables more revealing than most memoirs. A condition report checkbox doesn't lie. A memoir, written decades later, almost always does, at least a little. The KSTN tables have a quality that I associate with engineering blueprints. They show you the designer's intent, and when you compare them to the actual unit returns, the distance between intent and reality becomes the most honest measurement of an army's condition. The 352nd's authorized artillery strength was 36 howitzers. Its actual artillery strength in May 1944 was slightly below that, with some weapons of non-standard caliber, captured pieces integrated to fill gaps. This introduces a problem that pure strength figures obscure. A gun is only as useful as the ammunition you can feed it, and if your artillery regiment fires 3 different calibers of howitzer, German 10.5 centimeter, German 15 centimeter, and a captured French 105, your ammunition supply chain must maintain 3 separate pipelines. Every non-standard weapon added to a division's inventory was a logistical tax on its combat power. The KSTN planners knew this. Standardization was a core design principle. But the realities of 1944 meant that divisions took whatever weapons they could get, and the resulting heterogeneity degraded the very logistical efficiency the system was designed to maximize. The communications architecture of a German infantry division is the component I most want the listener to understand, because it was the nervous system whose disruption would cripple everything else. The primary means of communication was the Fernsprech network, field telephones connected by wire laid across the ground, or strung on improvised poles. Wire was reliable, secure from interception, and simple to operate. Its weakness was physical vulnerability. Artillery fire cut wire, vehicle movement crushed it, and in mobile operations, it couldn't be laid fast enough to maintain contact. The backup was the Funk network, radio, using sets like the FUG-12 and its variants. Radio was mobile and survivable against artillery, but it had 2 critical disadvantages. First, it was slower. Encoding and decoding messages took time, and the German Enigma encryption, while still used, had been compromised by the Allied Ultra program in ways the Germans did not fully appreciate. Second, and more immediately relevant, it could be intercepted, direction found, and used as a targeting tool by Allied signals intelligence and counter-battery radar. The effect of Allied artillery's ability to cut field wire was not merely to disrupt communication, it was to force the Germans onto radio, which could be intercepted, which gave the Allies intelligence, which directed more artillery onto German positions, which cut more wire. This feedback loop was devastating, and it accelerated as Allied artillery became more dominant in the summer and autumn of 1944. Here is the number that frames every subsequent chapter. A fully engaged German infantry division in defensive combat consumed approximately 80 metric tons of supply per day. Ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, fodder for the horses, replacement parts, signal wire, batteries, 80 tons. By comparison, its American counterpart consumed roughly 650 tons per day. That ratio, roughly 8-to-1, is not a reflection of German austerity or American wastefulness, though both played a role. It is the fundamental expression of 2 different ways of waging war. The German model relied on trained manpower, fieldcraft, and tactical skill to achieve effects. The American model relied on firepower, mechanization, and industrial output. The German soldier dug in, observed, and fired aimed shots from carefully chosen positions. The American system called in an artillery barrage, an airstrike, and an armored column. Both approaches worked. The German model was arguably more efficient in static defense, while the American model was devastatingly effective in offensive operations, where the full weight of industrial firepower could be concentrated. But the 8-to-1 ratio meant something else, something strategic. The American division's appetite for supply was so enormous that it could only be sustained by a logistical system of continental scale, the topic of Chapter 9. And the German division's relative frugality meant that its collapse, when it came, was driven less by supply failure than by the destruction of the men and systems that made the supply useful. The 352nd Infantry Division's Grenadier regiments contained a detail that most accounts of Omaha Beach omit entirely. Significant numbers of Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, men whose first language was often not German, and whose connection to the German national cause was, at best, complicated. Additionally, the division included overage reservists and men who had been through the comb-out process described in Chapter 1, transferred from rear area assignments, Luftwaffe ground organizations, and other non-combat roles. This is not to say the division was incompetent. Its defense of the Omaha sector was tenacious and effective, inflicting severe casualties on the American assault force. But it reframes the narrative. The elite German defenders of popular memory were, in significant part, a collection of second-line troops, stiffened by a cadre of experienced soldiers and officers, occupying excellent defensive positions, with good fields of fire and pre-registered artillery targets. The terrain did much of the work. The fortifications did much of the work. The individual soldiers fought hard, many of them very hard. But the division that held Omaha Beach was not a crack formation. It was a competent but patched-together unit that happened to be in the right defensive position on the wrong morning for the men coming ashore. The checkbox, bedingt angriffsfähig, conditionally capable of offensive action, told the truth. Now that we've opened the machine and examined its components, the regiments, the guns, the horses, the radios, the supply tonnage, the men, the question for the rest of this series becomes specific rather than general. We are no longer asking the vague question of, how did the Allies win? We are asking, what broke first? Was it the communications network, severed by artillery faster than the signalers could repair it? Was it the artillery itself, blinded by the absence of the Luftwaffe and deafened by Allied counter-battery fire? Was it the horses, dying faster than the remount service could replace them, paralyzing the supply columns that kept the infantry alive? Was it the ammunition, produced in factories that were being bombed and transported on railways that were being destroyed? Or was it the men themselves, the experienced NCOs and junior officers who held the whole system together with institutional knowledge and personal competence, dying one by one in attritional fighting that consumed them faster than the 16-week training cycle could replace them? The answer, as it usually is in complex system failures, is all of them, simultaneously, in a cascading interaction that no single chart or table can capture. But the KSTN tables give us the vocabulary to track the collapse with specificity, and that specificity matters. A general statement that the German army got weaker tells you nothing useful. A specific observation that a division's artillery regiment dropped from 36 to 22 howitzers while simultaneously shifting to 3 incompatible calibers tells you exactly how and why its defensive fire became less effective. The ledger is closed. The next chapter opens it again, under fire. Chapter 6. The Normandy Grind. The 7th of July, 1944. A clerk at Panzerlehr Division headquarters, somewhere in the hedgerow country south of Bayeux, updates the daily strength return. The form is routine, the Tagesmeldung, the daily report, and the clerk fills in the numbers with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has done this every day for weeks. Operational tanks and assault guns on the 6th of July, 66. Operational tanks and assault guns on the 7th of July, 49. The difference, 17, is written in the margin, underlined twice. There is no column for replacements received, because the answer is 0. No tanks came today. No tanks came yesterday. No tanks are coming tomorrow. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, the division's commander, a man who had served with Rommel in North Africa and knew what attrition looked like, does not need the daily strength return to tell him what is happening to his division. He can hear it. The hedgerow fighting south of Caen has been consuming his Panthers and Mark IVs at a rate that no repair section can match, and the bombers that arrive daily overhead have made it suicidal to move replacement vehicles forward in daylight. 17 tanks in one day. A division has about 160 tanks and assault guns at full strength. At this rate, Panzerlehr will cease to exist as an armored formation within a week. The mathematics are as simple and as merciless as the mathematics in the Zossen filing cabinets. Subtraction without addition. The same equation applied to steel instead of flesh. This chapter covers the 6 weeks that most histories of D-Day skip over, the period from roughly the 15th of June to the 24th of July, 1944, after the drama of the beach landings and before the drama of the Cobra breakout. They are, in narrative terms, the boring weeks. In military terms, they are the weeks that decided the Battle of France, the bocage, the ancient Norman hedgerow country, where fields are bordered by dense earthen banks topped with centuries-old vegetation, creating a maze of enclosed compartments, each roughly the size of a football pitch, was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. Each hedgerow was a natural fortification. Each field gap was a kill zone. Each advance of 200 meters required a separate small unit assault, and the Germans, even in their degraded 1944 state, were experts at defensive fighting in close terrain. The result was a battle of attrition that bore more resemblance to the Western Front of 1916 than to the mobile warfare both sides had practiced since 1939. And attrition, as Chapter 1 established, was a contest the German army could not win. But the cost of winning it, for the Allies, was measured in hedgerows taken and retaken, in tanks brewed up by concealed anti-tank guns, and in infantry casualties that strained even the American replacement system. The German response to D-Day had progressively committed every available armored reserve in the Western theater to the Normandy perimeter. By the end of June, 7 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions were deployed in and around the beachhead. Formations that had been intended as the operational reserve for a mobile counterattack to drive the Allies back into the sea. Instead, they were being fed into the defensive line piecemeal, used as firefighters to plug gaps created by British and Canadian offensives around Caen. Operation Epsom, launched by the British 8th Corps on the 26th of June, was designed, at least in retrospect, not to break through, but to draw in and destroy German armor. The 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 9th SS Panzer Division were committed as counterattack forces against the Epsom penetration, and in the fighting that followed, both divisions suffered losses in men and equipment that could not be replaced from the now shattered supply network behind the front. The British didn't break through. They didn't need to. Every Panther knocked out in a Normandy hedgerow was a Panther that wouldn't be available when the breakout came. Every experienced tank crew killed or wounded represented years of training that the replacement army's 16-week pipeline couldn't replicate. The bocage was eating the German armored reserve alive. This is where the Montgomery controversy must be addressed, because it sits at the heart of the Normandy campaign's historiographical debate, and I cannot in good conscience smooth it over. The standard British narrative, promoted by Montgomery himself in his post-war memoir and public statements, holds that the Caen battles were always part of a deliberate plan. British and Canadian forces would act as a hinge, drawing German armor to the eastern sector, while the Americans built up strength and broke out in the west. The plan, in this telling, worked exactly as designed. The problem is that Montgomery's own operational directives from June don't support this interpretation cleanly. His initial orders set the capture of Caen as a D-Day objective. It wasn't taken until the 9th of July. Subsequent operations, Epsom, Charnwood, Goodwood, were briefed to higher command as potential breakout attempts, not as attritional holding actions. When they failed to break through, Montgomery recharacterized them as having achieved their real purpose of drawing German armor. I find the controversy genuinely unresolvable, and I say that having read both the operational directives and the memoirs. My own editorial judgment is that the truth lies in the messy middle. Montgomery adapted to circumstances with considerable tactical skill and later claimed he designed them. The result, whatever the intent, was that the German Panzer Reserve was ground down in the bocage, and that grinding created the conditions for Cobra. Whether this was genius or opportunistic rebranding of failure depends on which sources you privilege, and honest historians can disagree. What cannot be disputed is the mechanical reality of what the bocage fighting did to the German defenders. The hedgerow defensive system was built around 3 weapons. First, the 8-centimeter Granatwerfer 34 mortar, positioned behind the hedgerow line. its crew invisible to the attacking infantry, its bombs falling almost vertically into the enclosed fields where American soldiers were advancing. The mortar was the real killer in the bocage, not the dramatic Tiger tank or the feared 88, but a tube-launched explosive dropped from above into spaces where there was no cover. Second, the MG-42 machine gun, positioned to create beaten zones along the lanes and gaps between hedgerows. Its rate of fire, roughly 1,200 rounds per minute in cyclic, capable of filling a gap with lethal steel in the seconds it took an American soldier to cross it. Third, a single-pack 40-75mm anti-tank gun, dug in and camouflaged to cover the 1 or 2 vehicle-accessible openings in each hedgerow line, waiting for the Sherman that would inevitably try to push through. This system, mortar, machine gun, anti-tank gun, repeated across thousands of individual field positions, was devastating against unsupported infantry and uncoordinated tank infantry attacks. Breaking it required a specific combined arms technique that the Americans developed through painful trial and error. Infantry to fix the defenders, engineers to blow gaps in the hedgerows, and tanks fitted with improvised cutting devices welded from German beach obstacles to push through the earthen banks at unexpected points. The famous Rhino tank, Sergeant Curtis Cullen's hedgerow cutter, was not a technological marvel. It was angle iron welded to a Sherman's hull, but it changed the tactical equation by giving tanks the ability to breach hedgerows at any point, rather than being channeled through the defended gaps. The asymmetry that decided the bocage fighting was not tactical, but logistical. Specifically, the replacement asymmetry described in chapters 1 and 2, now made concrete in the daily strength returns of opposing divisions. In June and July, the American replacement system could deliver fresh soldiers to frontline divisions within 48 hours of a request through the replacement depot system, a pipeline of trained men held at depots behind the front, categorized by specialty, and dispatched forward by truck to units that had reported casualties. The system was impersonal, sometimes callous in its treatment of men as interchangeable components, and the replacements it delivered were often inadequately prepared for the specific combat conditions they faced. But it worked. It filled holes. A company that lost 30 men on Tuesday had 30 new men by Thursday. The German system, by contrast, was producing replacements through a pipeline that was disrupted by bombing, slowed by rail destruction, and delivering men who were undertrained, even by the already diminished standards of 1944. Panzer divisions in Normandy received single-digit tank replacements in the entire month of July. The 352nd Infantry Division, the Omaha Beach Division we examined in Chapter 5, saw its strength drop from roughly 11,000 men to approximately 3,000 by mid-July, without significant replacement. The division was still fighting. Its designation still appeared on the situation map, but it had lost over 70% of its strength, and the men who remained were exhausted survivors, holding positions with the institutional memory of a full-strength formation and the actual combat power of a reinforced battalion. It strikes me, when I examine the Normandy campaign through the lens of attrition rather than maneuver, how much the standard narrative misses. The popular memory of D-Day centers on the 6th of June, the beach landings, the heroism, the drama of the first day. The popular memory of the breakout centers on Cobra, the carpet bombing, the armored exploitation, Patton's dash across France. The 6 weeks between, the grinding, repetitive, claustrophobic hedgerow fighting that created the conditions for both narratives, receives far less attention, perhaps because attrition is inherently undramatic. There is no single day to point to, no single commander's decision to celebrate, no cinematic moment of breakthrough. There is only the daily subtraction. 17 tanks today, 12 yesterday, 22 the day before. An infantry company attacking a hedgerow line and taking 40% casualties to advance 300 meters. A mortar crew firing until their tube is too hot to touch, repositioning, firing again. The Normandy campaign was won in this grind, and I want the listener to feel it, the suffocating, repetitive, casualty-intensive reality of 6 weeks of close combat in terrain that negated every technological advantage the Allies possessed, except the one that mattered most, the ability to replace what they lost. The bocage swallowed everything, but it swallowed the Luftwaffe's absence most consequentially. The German artillery arm, historically the Wehrmacht's deadliest branch, responsible for more Allied casualties than all other weapons combined in most engagements, was functionally crippled in Normandy, not because its guns were destroyed, though many were, but because its eyes were destroyed. Without aerial observation, without the Fiesler-Storch spotter planes that had directed German artillery fire since 1939, the gun crews couldn't see their targets. They fired on pre-registered defensive fire tasks. They fired on map coordinates relayed by forward observers in the hedgerows. But they couldn't conduct the systematic counter-battery fire or deep interdiction fire that had been the artillery's most lethal function. Meanwhile, Allied artillery operated with near-total information dominance. Their spotter aircraft flew unmolested. Their counter-battery radar located German gun positions by tracking incoming shells. And their fire control systems coordinated massed fires from multiple batteries with a precision and speed the German system couldn't match. The artillery duel in Normandy was not a contest between equivalent forces. It was a contest between an arm that could see and an arm that was blind. And the blind arm lost, not because its guns were less accurate or its crews less skilled, but because the fuel crisis described in Chapter 2 had eliminated the Luftwaffe from the equation. The connection is direct, causal, and traceable. Synthetic fuel plant destroyed in May. Aviation fuel production drops 90% by September. Luftwaffe grounded. German artillery blinded. Bocage defense weakened. Allied breakout enabled. The chapters of this story are not separate events. They are links in a chain. Operation Goodwood, launched by the British on the 18th of July, deserves specific mention because it crystallizes the attritional logic of the entire campaign. 3 British armored divisions, the 7th, 11th, and Guards, attacked south of Caen with massive air and artillery support, and in 3 days of fighting lost over 400 tanks. 400. The operation did not break through the German defensive crust. By any conventional measure of territorial gain versus losses suffered, it was a failure, and it generated bitter recrimination between Montgomery and Eisenhower. But Goodwood also consumed the last significant German anti-tank reserves east of Caen, the Tiger tanks, the Jagd Panther tank destroyers, the 88mm guns that had been the backbone of the German anti-armor defense. The British could replace 400 tanks. The shipyards and factories of Britain and America were producing Shermans and Cromwells at a rate that made even catastrophic single battle losses sustainable. The Germans could not replace what they lost. When the American breakout came at St. Lo 6 days later, the German defensive crust had been thinned to the point of transparency, not by a single brilliant stroke, but by the cumulative effect of 6 weeks of attritional combat that had consumed the defenders faster than they could be renewed. The daily strength returns from Panzer Lehr and the other German armored divisions in Normandy, when plotted on a graph, form a descending curve that intersects 0 at a predictable point, a date in late July or early August when the division would have ceased to exist as a combat formation, regardless of what the Allies did. German tank losses in Normandy from the 6th of June to the 24th of July totaled approximately 480 tanks and assault guns, destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Tank replacements delivered to the Normandy front in the same period, fewer than 100. A deficit of roughly 380 armored vehicles, each representing 25 to 45 tons of precision-manufactured steel, optics, and armor plate, each crewed by 4 or 5 men who had been trained for months or years. The 380 tanks the Germans couldn't replace in Normandy had downstream consequences that extended far beyond the bocage. They were the tanks that wouldn't be available for the defense of Paris, the retreat to the Seine, the attempt to hold the West Wall. Every tank lost in the hedgerows was a hole in every future defensive line, and the holes never closed. The clerk at Panzer Lehr headquarters updates the daily return again. 49 yesterday. Today, fewer. Tomorrow, fewer still. The margin notes grow larger. The replacement column stays blank. The hedgerows stand, indifferent, ancient, waiting for the next day's arithmetic of steel. The next 6 chapters, approximately 2,000 to 2,500 words per chapter. 10 paragraphs, each paragraph around 4 to 6 sentences. Chapter 7, Cobra's Jaw, The Breakout and the Pursuit. The 25th of July, 1944, a Friday. The air over the St. Lo Perriers Road trembles with the sound of 1,500 heavy bombers, flying in formations so dense they darken the sky over a rectangle of Norman farmland, roughly 6,000 yards long and 2,500 yards wide. Below them, the men of the American 7th Corps are supposed to be safely behind a withdrawal line, pulled back to give the bombers room. Some of them aren't far enough back. The first bombs fall on time and on target. 3,300 tons of high explosive, concentrated into an area smaller than some English country estates. But then the pattern creeps. Some bombardiers release late, some release on smoke markers drifting in the wind. The bombs walk backward into the American positions. 111 American soldiers are killed by their own Air Force in the space of minutes, and 490 more are wounded. Among the dead is Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the man who designed the American Army's entire ground forces training system, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. The 7th Corps Headquarters Journal records shorts at 11:42 hours in clipped shorthand and moves on to the next entry. McNair's death warrants no special notation. It was classified for weeks to deny the Germans propaganda value. The fratricide of July 25th is where this chapter must begin, not because it was the decisive moment of Operation Cobra, but because honest history requires acknowledging that the breakout was born in chaos and friendly fire, not clean operational brilliance. The Air Force's official history attributes the short bombing to wind drift and inadequate safety margins. The bombers approached perpendicular to the front line, rather than parallel to it, despite ground commanders' explicit requests for a parallel run. Bradley's memoir lays blame squarely on the Air Force's approach path. The Air Force's records note that a parallel approach over such a narrow target box would have stretched the bomber stream to an unacceptable length, exposing trailing aircraft to anti-aircraft fire for too long. Both arguments contain truth, and neither fully accounts for 111 dead Americans. The dispute was never resolved to anyone's satisfaction, and the fundamental problem, how to deliver massive air firepower close to friendly troops without killing them, remained a live tactical question for the rest of the war, and, as we'll see, remains one today. What matters for our narrative is that the bombing, despite the fratricide, devastated the German positions in the target zone. Panzer Lehr Division, directly beneath the carpet, lost 3 infantry companies that simply ceased to exist. Bayerlein's post-war testimony described his front line as a moonscape. The crust was shattered. The decision that turned a shattered crust into a full operational breakout belonged to one man, Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps. On the 26th of July, with initial reports ambiguous, the 1st Infantry Division and 9th Infantry Division reporting heavy resistance in some sectors and collapsed resistance in others, Collins faced a choice that no algorithm could make for him. The textbook answer was to wait, let the infantry secure the breach, confirm the breakthrough, and then commit the armored exploitation force. Collins chose aggression. He ordered the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions forward through the breach before the infantry had fully cleared it, gambling that speed would achieve what caution could not. Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division rolled south into uncertain territory, pushing past pockets of German resistance that were still fighting, trusting that follow-on infantry would clean up what the tanks drove past. It worked. It might not have. The distinction between a bold decision and a reckless one is often determined by the outcome, and Collins got the outcome he needed. By the 27th of July, the German front opposite 7th Corps was no longer a front at all. 84th Corps, the German formation responsible for the sector, effectively ceased to function as a coherent command. Its headquarters lost communication with its subordinate units. Its commander, General Lieutenant Dietrich von Koltitz, was transferred within days to the command of Paris, where he would later achieve a different kind of fame. The war diaries of the German units in the breakthrough zone become fragmentary and then stop entirely. The same archival silence we encountered in Bagration, the same terminal entries followed by blank pages. The difference is scale. Bagration consumed an entire army group across a 600-kilometer front. Cobra collapsed a corps sector across roughly 20 kilometers. But the operational consequence was identical. Once the defensive crust broke, there was nothing behind it. The German reserves that should have sealed the breach had already been consumed in the 6 weeks of bocage attrition described in the previous chapter. The hedgerow grind had done its work. The exploitation force was pushing through a door that had no lock. Avranches fell on the 31st of July, and with it, the entire operational geometry of the Normandy campaign changed. Patton's Third Army became operational, and its lead elements poured through the Avranches corridor, a single road junction through which an entire army was being fed. The logistical audacity was staggering. Military police units stood at intersections, directing columns of tanks, trucks, and infantry through a bottleneck barely wide enough for two-way traffic, under sporadic German air attack, while the flanks remained unsecured. A determined German counterattack at Avranches could have severed the corridor and trapped everything that had passed through it. That counterattack was coming. It was, in fact, being ordered at that very moment by a man in East Prussia who was looking at a map and seeing an opportunity that existed only on paper. But that is the subject of the next chapter. I want to dwell on Collins for a moment, because his decision on the 26th of July is the kind of battlefield judgment that resists easy analysis. The reports were mixed. The fog of war was thick, literally, in places, where smoke from the bombing obscured the ground. He chose to commit his armor before the situation was clear, and the choice accelerated the collapse of German resistance by at least 48 hours. Had the German defense been even slightly more coherent, had one more panzer division been available in reserve, had the Luftwaffe been able to contest the air, the premature commitment of armor could have produced a costly traffic jam in the breach, rather than a breakthrough. Collins's decision was informed by experience, intuition, and an understanding of his opponent's fragility that the daily intelligence summaries could support but not confirm. This is what command looks like at the operational level: incomplete information, irreversible decisions, and consequences that unfold faster than any headquarters can track them. The pursuit that followed Cobra has a quality in the operational records that is almost giddy, a word I use carefully because military documents are rarely giddy. But the daily situation reports from late July and early August track advances of 20, 30, 40 kilometers per day, a pace of movement that the Western Allies had not experienced since the fall of France in 1940, and that the operational planners had not anticipated this early. The German army in the West was not retreating in good order. It was disintegrating. Units that had held the Bocage line for 6 weeks were now fragments. Isolated companies, individual tanks, artillery batteries without infantry protection, supply columns abandoned on roadsides. The hedgerow defense system that had been so formidable was a static organism. Once bypassed, its components had no doctrine for mobile withdrawal and no transport to execute one, even if they had. The American spearheads drove past, around, and through the remnants, leaving them for follow-on units to collect. The prisoner counts mounted daily. The speed of the breakout created its own problems that would shape the rest of the campaign. The same logistical system that had struggled to supply the Bocage fighting now had to sustain armies advancing at pursuit speed across France, extending supply lines by dozens of kilometers every day, while the ports and beaches of Normandy remained the primary entry points for everything the armies consumed. The 650-ton daily appetite of an American division, described in Chapter 5, didn't decrease during pursuit. It increased because mobile operations consumed fuel at enormous rates, and because advancing units captured territory faster than supply depots could leapfrog forward. The seeds of the September supply crisis, the subject of Chapter 9, were planted here, in the euphoric days of late July and August, when the operational situation was so favorable that no one wanted to slow down long enough to build a sustainable logistical base. The pursuit felt like victory. It was, in many ways, the most operationally successful phase of the Western Allied campaign. But it was also a sprint that would leave the runners gasping at the German border, and that gasping would give the German army time it should never have had. To me, the most telling detail of the Cobra breakout isn't the bombing or the armored dash or the collapse of the German front. It's the fate of McNair, the man who designed the replacement system, the training pipeline, the divisional structure, the entire organizational framework that made the American army capable of fighting this war, was killed by the very air power that his army depended on. He was in Normandy as an observer. He had no command responsibilities, no reason to be that close to the front except professional curiosity and a sense of duty that put him in the wrong field at the wrong moment. His death was classified. His body was buried under a false name to prevent German intelligence from learning that a 3-star general had been killed by American bombs, and his replacement, General Devers, was announced without explanation. The architect died inside his own creation, destroyed by the forces he'd helped organize, and the machine kept running without him. There is no more precise metaphor for the industrial nature of the Allied war effort The system was designed to function regardless of individual loss, and it did. The bocage fighting is over. The breakout is complete. The exploitation is accelerating across France at a pace that outstrips supply, communication, and sometimes common sense. But before we follow the pursuit to its inevitable logistical collapse, we must turn south and west to a place called Mortagne, where Adolf Hitler has looked at a map and seen an opportunity. The American corridor at Avranches, narrow, vulnerable, dependent on a single road junction, looks, on a situation map viewed from 1,000 kilometers away, like an invitation. 4 panzer divisions, attacking westward, could sever the corridor and trap everything south of it. The field commanders who received this order know it is a fantasy. They protest, formally and informally, through every channel available to them. They are overruled. The order stands. And the German army, instead of withdrawing eastward to a defensible line, will drive deeper into a salient from which there is no escape. The map in East Prussia shows arrows pointing west. The reality in Normandy is about to show what happens when arrows drawn by a man who hasn't visited the front in years meet the air power, the artillery, and the arithmetic that make those arrows meaningless. Chapter 8. Mortagne and the Falaise Pocket. Hitler commands the trap. The 2nd of August, 1944. In the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, an order is being finalized for transmission to OB West. Operation Luttich. 4 panzer divisions are to counterattack westward through the town of Mortagne, drive to the coast at Avranches, and sever the American breakout corridor. The order is militarily insane, and the men who must execute it know it. General Feldmarschall Gunther von Kluge, the Commander-in-Chief West, has telephoned his protests. The records of OB West preserve his objections in the dry language of staff communication: insufficient forces, impossible air situation, exposed flanks. General Feldmarschall Walter Model's Army Group B staff has lodged similar concerns. They have proposed what they call the small solution, a limited counterattack to blunt the American advance east of the Meuse, preserving the remaining panzer forces for a defensive campaign. Hitler has chosen the large solution: drive to the sea, split the Allied armies. The field commander's written objections are filed. The order stands, and with it, the German army in the west enters the trap that will destroy it. The Mortagne counterattack began on the 7th of August and failed within hours, not because the German soldiers lacked courage or the panzer crews lacked skill, but because the operation was launched into the teeth of total Allied air superiority and was detected almost before it started. Ultra intercepts, the decoded German Enigma communications that the Allies read with varying degrees of timeliness, had provided warning of the counterattack's general timing and direction. Allied fighter bombers were pre-positioned. When the German columns moved westward in the pre-dawn darkness, they emerged into daylight to find Typhoons and P-47 Thunderbolts stacked above them. The advance stalled within hours, gaining roughly 10 kilometers at its deepest penetration, before grinding to a halt under air attack, artillery fire, and the stubborn defense of one critical position. On Hill 317, east of Mortagne, the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, part of the 30th Infantry Division, was surrounded and held its position for 6 days. The battalion's forward observers, perched on the hilltop with clear sightlines over the German approach routes, called in devastating artillery fire on every column that moved below them. Hill 317 was the cork in the bottle, and it held. But Mortagne's real significance was not what happened at Mortagne. It was what happened because of Mortagne. By ordering the counterattack westward, Hitler had pushed the remaining German forces deeper into a salient that was now vulnerable to encirclement from 2 directions. The Canadians and British were driving south from Caen. The Americans, wheeling north from Le Mans under Patton, were swinging up toward Argentan. If the 2 forces met, the entire German 7th Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army would be trapped in a pocket between Falaise and Argentan. Von Kluge could see this on his map. Every staff officer at OB West could see it. The solution was obvious: abandon the Mortagne counterattack and withdraw eastward immediately, before the pocket closed. Hitler forbade withdrawal. He ordered Mortagne to be reinforced and the attack renewed. The panzers that should have been racing east to escape were instead ordered west, deeper into the closing jaw. The Führer's command structure, the system in which no field commander could order a retreat without explicit authorization from a man 1,000 kilometers away, was now actively manufacturing the catastrophe it was designed to prevent. Kluge's personal situation adds a dimension of psychological horror to the operational crisis that the purely military narrative cannot capture. He was implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler, not as a primary conspirator, but as a man who had known of the plot's existence and had not reported it. The Gestapo investigation was closing in. Every communication between Kluge and Hitler was now shadowed by mutual suspicion. Kluge feared arrest and execution. Hitler suspected Kluge of deliberate sabotage. On August 15th, Kluge went missing for an entire day. His radio vehicle was destroyed by an Allied air attack while he was visiting the front, cutting him off from all communication. Hitler, already paranoid, interpreted the silence as evidence that Kluge was negotiating a surrender with the Allies. He wasn't. He was simply trapped in a ditch, unable to contact anyone. But the incident sealed his fate. He was replaced by Model on August 17th. 2 days later, driving back to Germany under effective recall, Kluge swallowed a cyanide capsule near Metz. His final letter to Hitler survives in fragments. "I depart from you, my Führer, as one who stood nearer to you than you perhaps realized." Whether this was loyalty or reproach has been debated for 80 years. I read it as both. The last words of a man trapped between two dooms, the enemy in front and the regime behind, and unable to escape either. The Falaise pocket closed, slowly, messily, and incompletely, between the 13th and 21st of August. The Canadian First Army, driving south, and the American forces, pushing north, converged on the towns of Falaise, Argentan, Chambois, and Trun. The fighting was intense. The Polish 1st Armored Division, holding the critical position at Mont-Ormel, fought off desperate German breakout attempts for 2 days in some of the most savage close combat of the entire campaign. Inside the pocket, the scene defied description in anything but sensory terms. Allied artillery and air power concentrated on an area roughly 30 kilometers by 20. Every road, every crossroads, every column of retreating vehicles was a target. The Chambois-Trun road became a corridor of destruction that veterans on both sides recalled with a horror that decades could not diminish. The smell of burning vehicles, dead horses, and human remains in August heat was described in multiple Allied soldier accounts as something that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. And here we encounter the controversy that makes the Falaise pocket a historiographical battleground rather than a simple victory narrative. On the 12th of August, Patton's 15th Corps had reached Argentan, roughly 25 kilometers south of the Canadian positions near Falaise. The pocket was not yet closed. A gap of 25 kilometers remained. Patton wanted to drive north and seal it. Bradley ordered him to stop. The halt at Argentan allowed between 20,000 and 40,000 German soldiers to escape eastward through the gap before Canadian and Polish forces finally linked up with the Americans on the 19th and 20th. Bradley's memoir claims the halt was motivated by fear of a friendly fire collision between American forces driving north and Canadian forces driving south. Some historians argue that 15th Corps was too weak to hold the northern shoulder of the pocket against German breakout attempts. Others suggest that Bradley made a cautious operational judgment that a stronger position slightly further back was preferable to a thin cordon that the Germans might rupture. The debate is unresolved and probably unresolvable. The decision was made in minutes, on incomplete information, and the arguments for and against it are all plausible. What is not debatable is the consequence. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, who should have been captured, instead escaped to fight again. The most telling detail of the Falaise pocket isn't the battle itself. It's what the post-war operational research found about the air power narrative. The image of the Falaise pocket in popular memory is defined by the rocket-firing Typhoon, the iconic photograph of a German column destroyed from the air. Pilot claims during the battle were enormous. Hundreds of tanks destroyed, thousands of vehicles. But the 2nd Tactical Air Force's own operational research section conducted a ground survey of the pocket after the battle and found something sobering. Many of the destroyed vehicles had been abandoned by their crews before the aircraft arrived, damaged by artillery, out of fuel, or simply left behind during the flight eastward. The number of vehicles actually destroyed by air attack was significantly lower than pilot claims suggested. I must be honest about this. The evidence suggests that the Falaise killing ground was as much an artillery victory as an air victory, and possibly more a victory of logistical collapse, vehicles running out of fuel and being abandoned, than either. The typhoon myth endures because it is cinematic. The reality is more complex and less photogenic. The losses are almost impossible to convey without sounding clinical, but the clinical numbers matter. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers were killed inside the pocket. Roughly 50,000 were captured. Equipment losses in the pocket and the subsequent retreat to the Seine included an estimated 1,500 tanks and assault guns, 3,500 vehicles, and 500 artillery pieces. The German 7th Army, which had held the Normandy front for 2.5 months, functionally ceased to exist. But, and this is the critical but that connects this chapter to what follows, the 20,000 to 40,000 soldiers who escaped through the Falaise Gap carried almost no heavy equipment. They crossed the Seine on ferries and improvised bridges. They straggled eastward through the French countryside, and they arrived in Germany with nothing but their uniforms and their experience. That experience was the seed from which the autumn reconstitution would grow. The veteran NCOs and junior officers who slipped through the gap at Chambois would become the cadre around which new divisions were built. Divisions that would appear in the Ardennes 4 months later with new designations, new equipment, and the irreplaceable institutional knowledge of men who had survived the worst the Allies could deliver. This chapter must close with Kluge, because his end illuminates something about the German command system that the operational narrative alone cannot convey. A field marshal, one of the most senior officers in the German military, chose suicide over the return to a regime that would certainly arrest him and probably execute him, not for military failure, but for insufficient loyalty. His death was not mourned publicly. His letter to Hitler was read, filed, and forgotten. The system that had produced him, the Prussian-German officer tradition of duty, competence, and institutional loyalty, had been so thoroughly captured by the Nazi regime that its senior members faced an impossible choice: obey orders they knew would lead to catastrophe, or disobey and face the executioner. Most chose obedience. Some, like the July 20th conspirators, chose resistance and were killed for it. Kluge chose neither, and both. He protested within channels, obeyed when overruled, and took his own life when the consequences became inescapable. His story is not heroic. It is the story of an institution's moral collapse, playing out in one man's final drive through the French countryside. The pocket is closed. The dead are counted. The escaped are fleeing east. In the wreckage along the Chambois-Trun road, abandoned vehicles cool in the August sun, and the papers inside them, orders, strength returns, personal letters, scatter in the wind. Some of these documents will be collected by Allied intelligence teams. Some will rot in the rain. Some will surface decades later in archives and private collections, carrying the last words of units that no longer exist. The German army in the West has suffered a catastrophe comparable to Bagration in the East, and both catastrophes occurred within the same 8-week period of the summer of 1944. The combined losses are staggering, but the war will not end for 9 more months. The question of why, the question of how an army that has lost this much can continue to fight, requires us to turn away from the battlefield entirely and look instead at a port, a river, and a supply crisis that gave the German army the one thing it needed most: time. Chapter 9: The Scheldt and the Supply Wall. The 5th of September, 1944. In a logistics briefing room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, a staff officer in the G4 section, Supply and Logistics, types a situation report that contains one of the war's most consequential sentences. Antwerp, the largest port in northwestern Europe, has been captured intact by the British 11th Armored Division. The docks are undamaged. The cranes still work. The warehouses are full of nothing useful, but they stand. The officer types this fact and immediately adds what every logistician in the theater already knows. The port is useless while the Germans hold both banks of the 54-mile Scheldt estuary that connects Antwerp to the North Sea. No ship can reach the docks until the estuary is cleared. Someone, a colleague, a superior, a fellow officer reading the draft, has written in pencil beside this entry a single word: when. The question would not be answered for 85 days. The Allied pursuit across France after the Falaise breakout was one of the most spectacular ground advances of the war. Paris liberated on the 25th of August, Brussels on the 3rd of September, Antwerp on the 4th. The speed was intoxicating. The German army appeared to be in total collapse, and the momentum suggested that the war might end by Christmas, perhaps sooner. But the pursuit had outrun its own logistical system in ways that the combat commanders, fixated on the operational map, were slow to recognize and slower to address. The problem was structural. The Allies were still supplying their armies primarily through the Normandy beaches and the battered port of Cherbourg, which together could deliver roughly 15,000 tons per day. The combined daily requirement for all Allied armies in northwestern Europe had reached approximately 22,000 tons. The deficit, 7,000 tons per day, was not a number that could be wished away by operational enthusiasm. 7,000 tons per day. That gap meant fuel was rationed by the jerry can, ammunition allocations were cut, and offensive operations had to be sequenced rather than conducted simultaneously. An army that could do everything at once in July could barely do one thing at a time by September. The emergency response to this crisis was the Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy system running from the Normandy beaches to the advancing front along reserved one-way highway loops. It was an extraordinary logistical achievement, and a heroic effort by the predominantly African-American transportation companies that drove the routes, often around the clock under blackout conditions. It was also, in strictly mathematical terms, a losing proposition. At its peak, the Red Ball Express consumed nearly as much fuel delivering supplies as the fuel it actually delivered. The trucks themselves needed gasoline. The tires wore out on roads not designed for this volume of heavy military traffic. The drivers were exhausted. The system moved tonnage forward, but it could not close the 7,000-ton daily gap, and every mile the front advanced made the problem worse by lengthening the supply line. British logistical staff at 21st Army Group headquarters were less generous in their assessment. Their records suggest that Eisenhower's allocation of truck transport disproportionately favored American forces at the expense of British and Canadian operations that might have cleared the Scheldt sooner. This is a source conflict rooted in national perspective. Each army's historical record prioritizes its own narrative of who was shortchanged. The decision that would prove most costly was made in September, when Eisenhower allocated the theater's limited logistical resources to support Operation Market Garden. Montgomery's ambitious plan to seize a corridor of bridges through the Netherlands and cross the Rhine at Arnhem, rather than directing maximum effort toward clearing the Scheldt estuary. Market Garden has generated its own library of books and films, and this is not the place to relitigate its execution in detail. What matters for this narrative is the opportunity cost. Every ton of supply and every truck mile devoted to Market Garden was a ton and a mile not devoted to the Canadian First Army, which needed those resources to clear the German forces holding the Scheldt. The Canadians were given a secondary priority for supply, and the consequence was a delay of weeks in launching the Scheldt operations. Weeks during which the German 15th Army, which might have been trapped on the Channel coast, escaped northward across the Scheldt estuary and reinforced the very positions the Canadians would later have to assault. It frustrates me as a historian that Arnhem receives a dozen popular books and films, while the Scheldt, which mattered far more strategically, is virtually unknown outside Canada. The Battle of the Scheldt, fought from the 2nd of October to the 8th of November 1944, was some of the most brutal and least glamorous fighting of the entire Western Front. The terrain was flat, waterlogged polder. Land reclaimed from the sea, crisscrossed with dikes and drainage ditches, offering no cover and no high ground. The German defenders flooded large areas deliberately, forcing the Canadians and British to advance along narrow causeways that were pre-registered killing zones for German artillery and machine guns. The assault on Walcheren Island, the fortified position controlling the northern bank of the estuary mouth, required amphibious landings supported by the deliberate breaching of the island's sea dikes, flooding the interior and confining the fighting to the raised edges. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 4th Canadian Armoured Division bore the brunt of this fighting, supported by British commandos and specialized assault units. The casualties were heavy, the conditions miserable, and the recognition, then and now, minimal. The first Allied supply ship to dock at Antwerp, the Canadian-built Fort Cataraqui, arrived on the 28th of November, 1944. 85 days after the port was captured. Nearly 3 months to turn a captured port into a functioning one. This timeline was not caused by laziness or incompetence. It was the product of mine clearance operations in the estuary. Over 100 German mines had to be swept. the removal of demolitions and obstructions from the harbor approaches, the establishment of port operating organizations and cargo handling equipment, and the German V-weapon campaign that targeted Antwerp with V-1 flying bombs and V-2 ballistic missiles throughout the autumn and winter. The engineering reality of port clearance is one of the war's least appreciated technical challenges. Cherbourg, taken in late June, required 5 weeks of intensive engineering work before it could handle significant cargo. Antwerp's estuary problem was an order of magnitude more complex. The physics of harbor engineering, not German resistance alone, determined the timeline. The strategic consequence of the 85-day gap was simple. The Allied armies spent September, October, and much of November in a condition of logistical austerity that prevented the kind of broad front offensive that might have broken through the German border defenses before they could be re-established. Instead of multiple simultaneous thrusts, Eisenhower could support only sequential operations. A push here, a pause there, then a push somewhere else. This sequencing gave the German command exactly what it needed: time to scrape together the rebuilt formations described in the next chapter, time to re-garrison the West Wall fortifications, and time to plan the Ardennes counteroffensive that would consume the last German reserves. The supply crisis of autumn 1944 is not a dramatic story. There are no heroic charges, no decisive battles, no commanders whose bold decisions changed the course of events. There is only a 7,000-ton daily deficit, a port that couldn't be used, and the slow, grinding consequence of logistical failure on operational tempo. I note that the German 15th Army's escape across the Scheldt in September, facilitated by the Allied focus on Market Garden, is one of those episodes where an operational choice created its own future obstacle. The forces that escaped became the garrison that the Canadians had to fight. The decision to prioritize Arnhem over the Scheldt didn't just delay the opening of Antwerp, it actively reinforced the enemy defending the approaches to Antwerp. This kind of cascading consequence is easy to identify in hindsight, and nearly impossible to see in the moment, when the operational map shows an apparently open corridor to the Rhine, and the Scheldt looks like a secondary problem that can wait. But logistics doesn't wait. Every day Antwerp was closed, the 7,000-ton gap grew wider in its cumulative effect, and the German army grew stronger behind its border defenses. The relationship is direct. Supply failure bought time, and time bought reconstitution. Antwerp's pre-war capacity was approximately 80,000 tons per day, more than enough to supply the entire Allied force in northwestern Europe several times over. By December, after the port was finally operational and the engineering work was complete, throughput was climbing toward that capacity, and the logistical crisis was easing. But the damage was done. The autumn of 1944, the months between the triumph of the pursuit and the shock of the Ardennes, was a period of strategic frustration in which the Allies had the combat power to defeat the German army, but not the supply to sustain the effort. The war that should have ended in 1944 continued into 1945 because of a 54-mile estuary, a 3-month port clearance timeline, and a resource allocation decision that prioritized a dramatic airborne operation over a mundane but critical logistics objective. The penciled question on the G4 report, when, was answered on the 28th of November. By then, winter was setting in. The German army had rebuilt itself behind the West Wall, and the worst was not over. The Fort Cataraqui docked, the cranes began to lift, and the war, which should have been dying, found new breath. Chapter 10. The Miracle of the West Wall. Reconstitution on the Edge of Collapse. A day in September, 1944. In an OKW staff office, a planning document proposes the creation of 25 new Volksgrenadier divisions. The document is thorough. Tables of organization, equipment allocations, proposed training schedules. Someone, likely from a training command reviewing the draft, has read the proposed timeline for bringing these divisions to combat readiness: 6 weeks. In the margin, a single word in pencil: unmöglich, impossible. The word is underlined. And then, apparently, someone else has drawn a line through it. The institutional disagreement between the man who understood training and the man who needed the divisions regardless is captured in 3 pen strokes. The line through impossible doesn't make it possible. It just makes the objection disappear from the record. The divisions will be formed. They will be sent to the front. and the question of whether they are ready will be answered not by any staff officer's margin note, but by the artillery and armor waiting for them on the other side. The German Army's reconstitution in the autumn of 1944 is, depending on your analytical framework, either a remarkable organizational achievement or an elaborate act of institutional self-deception. The facts are these. Between the catastrophes of Bagration and Falaise, the German army had lost roughly 1.5 million men in the summer of 1944, the worst losses of the entire war, compressed into approximately 3 months. By any reasonable military assessment, this should have been terminal. The force that remained was a skeleton. Yet by November, the German order of battle in the West had been substantially rebuilt, new divisions were manning the West Wall fortifications, and reserves were being accumulated for a counter-offensive. How this happened is a story of organizational desperation, executed with genuine competence, and understanding it is essential because these rebuilt formations would determine the character of the war's final 6 months. The Volksgrenadier Division was the answer to a question that couldn't honestly be asked. How do you build a fighting formation when you have neither the men nor the time to build it properly? The design was a deliberate compromise, smaller than the standard infantry division it replaced, roughly 10,000 men versus 12,500, with a structure that traded manpower for automatic firepower. The Volksgrenadier regiments were organized around the STG-44 assault rifle and increased allocations of submachine guns, the theory being that a squad armed with automatic weapons could deliver the volume of fire that a larger squad with bolt-action rifles had previously provided. The rate of fire comparison is instructive. The Kar 98K bolt-action rifle produced 10 to 15 aimed rounds per minute in the hands of a trained soldier, while the STG-44 delivered 40 to 50. But the ammunition consumption per soldier tripled or quadrupled, creating a new supply dependency at precisely the moment the supply system was collapsing. The weapon was excellent, the mathematics of feeding it were not. The manpower for these new divisions came from every source the German state could drain. The Luftwaffe was combed out, entire ground organizations, redundant airfield units, anti-aircraft crews whose guns lacked ammunition were converted to infantry. The Kriegsmarine contributed sailors from ships that would never sail again. Rear area services were stripped to the bone. The civilian economy yielded men through expanded conscription, pulling workers from factories that were themselves producing the weapons the army needed. And on the 25th of September, 1944, the Volkssturm decree was issued, not through military channels but through the Nazi Party apparatus, under Martin Bormann's authority, mobilizing all remaining males between 16 and 60 for home defense. The Volkssturm was not a military organization in any meaningful sense. Its members received minimal training, were armed with whatever was available, often nothing more than a Panzerfaust and an armband, and were led by party officials rather than professional officers. The barrel was not merely being scraped, the barrel itself was being thrown into the furnace. The West Wall, the Siegfried Line, the pre-war fortification system along Germany's western border, provided the physical framework for the reconstitution. In theory, it was a continuous belt of concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and prepared positions stretching from the Swiss border to the Netherlands. In practice, it had been neglected since 1940, when the Wehrmacht's attention turned east. Many bunkers had been stripped of their weapons. Some had been used for storage, others as livestock shelters. Engineer reports from September 1944 describe positions overgrown with vegetation, their firing apertures blocked, their communications trenches collapsed. The reactivation of the West Wall was a hasty, improvised effort. Old bunkers were rearmed with whatever weapons were available. Gaps were filled with hastily dug field positions, and the new Volksgrenadier divisions were slotted into sectors they'd had no time to reconnoiter. American intelligence initially took the wall seriously. SHAEF G2 reports predicted heavy fighting, and in some sectors, where the fortifications were properly manned and the terrain was favorable, the prediction proved correct. But the wall's value was as much psychological as physical. Its concrete gave green troops a sense of security that open field positions would not have, and its name, broadcast on German radio as the impregnable barrier protecting the fatherland, bolstered home front morale at a moment when morale badly needed bolstering. I admire, in a cold way, the organizational competence of the German staff system, even in collapse. The The machinery of divisional formation, the KSTN tables, the replacement allocation system, the training schedules, continued to function with mechanical precision, even as the inputs it processed became increasingly inadequate. New divisions received their numbers, their organizational charts, their equipment allocations. They were assigned to corps and army sectors. They submitted Zustandsberichte with checked boxes. The paperwork was immaculate. But I am wary of admiration here, and I want to be explicit about why. These rebuilt divisions were the instrument by which the war was prolonged past any rational endpoint. Every Volksgrenadier division formed in September represented 10,000 men who would spend the next 8 months fighting and dying in a cause that the personnel officers in Zossen, the men with the red pencil arrows, already knew was lost. The organizational achievement was real. Its purpose was the perpetuation of a catastrophe. Many of the new Volksgrenadier divisions carried the numbers of destroyed formations, a deliberate choice that reveals something about the institutional psychology of the German military. The 352nd Volksgrenadier Division, for example, nominally succeeded the 352nd Infantry Division that had been destroyed at Omaha Beach and in the Normandy fighting. The new division contained almost none of the original's personnel. It inherited the designation, and with it, the implied continuity of unit tradition, regimental honor, and institutional identity. The Wehrmacht believed that numbers carried fighting power, that a soldier assigned to a division with a distinguished history would fight harder than one assigned to a number with no past. Whether this belief was justified is debatable. The evidence from the Ardennes, where some Volksgrenadier divisions fought tenaciously and others collapsed on first contact, suggests that training and leadership mattered more than nomenclature. But the practice itself is revealing, an army perpetuating itself through names while its substance disappeared, like a building whose facade remains standing after the interior has burned out. The artillery problem was the quiet crisis within the reconstitution, invisible on the organizational chart, but devastating in practice. A Volksgrenadier division had roughly 20% fewer artillery pieces than the standard infantry division it replaced. Worse, the guns it did receive were increasingly heterogeneous. German 10.5-centimeter howitzers mixed with captured French, Soviet, and Czech weapons, each firing different ammunition calibers. A single Volksgrenadier division's artillery regiment might fire as many as 5 different calibers, each requiring its own supply chain, its own ammunition dumps, its own logistics coordination. The KSTN tables list the authorized weapons. They don't capture the logistical chaos that heterogeneous armament created at the division level. Every non-standard gun was a separate problem, a separate ammunition requirement, a separate set of spare parts, a separate training need, multiplied across 25 divisions. The replacement surge of September and October generated roughly 700,000 new soldiers for the Western Front, drawn from every source described above. 700,000. The number sounds impressive until you consider what it represents. The Luftwaffe ground crew who had never held a rifle in combat, the 16-year-old Hitlerjugend boy who had trained for 4 weeks, the 48-year-old factory worker whose last military experience was the peacetime Reichswehr of the 1920s, the convalescent soldier returning to duty with a limp and a medical waiver. These were the men who would man the West Wall. These were the men who would be launched into the Ardennes in December. The quantity was there. The quality was a fiction, maintained by organizational charts and condition reports with checked boxes. The red pencil arrow in the Zossen filing cabinet, drawn in January of this same year, had been tracking this trajectory for months. The curve it described, downward, always downward, had not changed direction. It had merely been papered over with new division numbers and old unit traditions, and the institutional momentum of a military bureaucracy that knew no other response to crisis except to form another division and send it to the front. The autumn reconstitution was complete by November. The West Wall was manned. The reserves were assembling. The Volksgrenadier divisions had submitted their condition reports, and the boxes were checked, and the numbers were forwarded to OKW, and the planning staff began work on an operation that would commit every reformed division and every hoarded fuel reserve to a single throw. The men in the bunkers along the German border didn't know what was coming. Only the innermost circle of the command structure knew about the Ardennes plan. But the trained eye, reading the organizational charts and the supply allocations, could have guessed. Someone was saving fuel. Someone was holding back panzer divisions from the defensive line. Someone, somewhere in the hierarchy, was planning an offensive with an army that had just barely survived its own defensive crisis. The margin note, unmöglich, crossed out, had been proven right in its original assessment and wrong in its administrative cancellation. The divisions existed, they were not ready, and they were about to be committed to a battle that would consume them. Chapter 11. The Hurtgen and the Blood Price of No Alternative. A morning in early November 1944. In a forward aid station of the 28th Infantry Division, somewhere in the Hurtgen forest, a medical officer logs casualties. The triage record is handwritten: names, injuries, disposition. The entries are rapid, the handwriting deteriorating as the morning progresses. Patient after patient, shrapnel wounds, trench foot, burns. The particular injuries caused by tree bursts, artillery shells detonating in the forest canopy, spraying wood fragments and steel downward into positions that would have offered protection in open terrain. Between 0600 and 1200 hours, 87 casualties passed through this single station, one every 4 minutes, on average, for 6 hours. The notation for one patient reads, in hasty pencil, a clinical shorthand of injury and evacuation category, and then a single additional word: crying. The clinical assessment and the human observation, side by side, in a medic's exhausted hand. The Hurtgen Forest sits in this series not because it was a turning point or a strategic triumph, but because it was neither. An honest history requires accounting for the battles that shouldn't have been fought on the terms on which they were fought. The Hurtgen was an American tactical failure, arguably the most significant one on the Western Front, and including it is an editorial obligation in a documentary that purports to explain how the Allies broke the German army. Because in the Hurtgen, the process reversed. Here, the degraded, understrength, reconstituted German army broke American units with a thoroughness that should have been impossible given the material imbalance between the two sides. Understanding how and why requires understanding the terrain, and the terrain of the Hurtgen was unlike anything the American army had encountered in Europe. Dense Sitka spruce, planted in rows so uniform they created corridors that channeled movement and funneled fire. Visibility rarely exceeded 20 meters. The forest floor was a tangle of roots and undergrowth that made movement exhausting and silent approach impossible. Armor could not operate off the few logging roads, and the logging roads were pre-registered targets for German mortars and artillery. The canopy, thick, interlocking, evergreen, created the tree burst effect that defined the Hurtgen's particular lethality. When a high explosive shell struck a tree trunk or heavy branch 15 to 25 meters above the ground, it detonated in the canopy and produced a downward cone of fragments mixed with wooden splinters, some of them a foot long, traveling at velocities sufficient to penetrate helmets, flesh, and the thin overhead cover of a standard foxhole. In open terrain, a soldier lying prone was relatively safe from all but a direct hit. In the Hurtgen, lying prone was counterproductive. The fragments came from above, not from the side. The only effective defense was covered positions with substantial overhead timber protection, and constructing such positions in frozen ground took hours that attacking infantry didn't have. The Battle of Schmidt, fought by the 28th Infantry Division from the 2nd to the 8th of November, encapsulates the Hurtgen's futility with particular clarity. The division attacked with 3 regiments through the forest toward the town of Schmidt, a crossroads whose tactical value was linked to the Rohr River dams further south. The attack plan required the division to advance along 3 divergent axes through terrain that prevented mutual support between the regiments. The 112th Infantry Regiment reached Schmidt on the 2nd of November. By the 3rd, a German counterattack, led by elements of the 116th Panzer Division, had driven the Americans out of Schmidt and cut the single supply trail connecting the forward battalions to the rear. The Call Trail, a logging road descending a steep gorge wall, described by one engineer officer as adequate for a jeep if you were optimistic, was the division's only supply artery to the forward positions, and it was now under direct German observation and fire. 2 battalions of the 112th were effectively trapped beyond the gorge, unable to be reinforced or resupplied, and were destroyed as fighting units over the following days. The after-action reports tell 2 different stories, depending on who wrote them. The 28th Division's own report attributes the failure to terrain difficulty and the unexpected strength of the German counterattack. 5th Corps' assessment, written by General Giro's staff, 1 level higher, notes deficiencies in the division's attack plan, insufficient concentration of force, inadequate artillery preparation given the terrain, and a critical failure to secure the Col Trail as a logistics route before pushing forces beyond it. The division blames circumstances. The Corps blames the division. Both are partly right, and the tension between the two accounts is instructive. Institutional self-assessment in the immediate aftermath of failure is almost always partial. Each echelon protects its own decisions and identifies failures at the level above or below. The historian's task is to read both accounts against the terrain, the timeline, and the casualty figures, and arrive at a synthesis that neither source provides on its own. What the casualty figures reveal is as disturbing as any narrative account. In some Hurtgen engagements, psychiatric casualties, soldiers diagnosed with combat exhaustion, the contemporary term for what we would now recognize as acute combat stress reaction, equaled or exceeded the number of physical wounded. Divisional surgeon reports contain statistical breakdowns that show this pattern repeated across multiple units committed to the forest fighting. The Hurtgen broke men psychologically at a rate that the American Army had not seen since the worst Pacific Island battles. The combination of restricted visibility, you couldn't see the enemy, overhead threat, tree bursts against which there was no easy defense, constant dampness and cold, November in the Eifel is miserable, and the claustrophobic enclosure of the forest canopy created conditions that eroded psychological resilience faster than any open terrain battle could. Trench foot, the tissue damage caused by prolonged exposure to wet and cold, accounted for thousands of additional non-battle casualties. Feet swelled, blistered, blackened. Men who couldn't walk couldn't fight. The forest took them out of the line as effectively as any German bullet. I include this chapter because a documentary that tells only the story of Allied success would be propaganda, not history. The Hurtgen Forest is where I, as the series' editorial voice, must hold the Allies accountable for a battle that may have been fundamentally unnecessary. The primary strategic objective, protecting the right flank of the advance toward the Rhine and controlling the Ruhr dams, could arguably have been achieved by a defensive posture that contained the forest, rather than attacking into it. Post-war American Army studies criticize the Hurtgen as an attritional sinkhole caused by command fixation on a terrain feature that should have been bypassed. The counter-argument, that the Germans could have used the forest as a staging area for counterattacks against the advancing Allied line, has merit but doesn't fully justify the cost. Total American casualties in the Hurtgen Forest fighting across all phases, from September to December 1944, approximately 33,000, including 9,000 non-battle casualties. German casualties in the same fighting, approximately 28,000, near parity. In a battle where the attacker held every material advantage, more men, more guns, total air superiority, near parity is a defeat by any reasonable measure. The grim arithmetic of the Hurtgen had a direct consequence that extends beyond the forest itself and into the next chapter of this series. The American divisions that were chewed up in the Hurtgen, the 28th, the 4th, the 9th, the 1st, were among the units subsequently placed in quiet sectors of the front, to rest and absorb replacements. The sector chosen for the 28th and the 106th Infantry Divisions was the Ardennes, the thinly held, densely forested sector of the Belgian-German border that the Allied command assessed as unlikely to see major German action. The divisions placed there were either exhausted from the Hurtgen or newly arrived and inexperienced. The connection between the Hurtgen's cost and the Ardennes' vulnerability is not accidental. It is a direct causal chain. The Hurtgen consumed the combat power of divisions that were then placed in the path of the German counteroffensive, precisely because they were too weak to be used elsewhere. The forest's blood price was paid twice. The medical records from the Hurtgen forward aid stations sit in the National Archives in files that are, even 80 years later, difficult to read without a visceral response. The clinical shorthand, the abbreviations for wound types, the evacuation categories, the terse notations, is the language of a system under extreme stress, processing human damage at industrial scale. The word crying, appended to one patient's entry, breaks through the clinical detachment like a crack in a wall. The medic who wrote it was probably not making a diagnostic observation. There is no medical category for crying. He was recording what he saw, in the only space available, because the form didn't have a box for it. The Hurtgen doesn't have a monument comparable to the D-Day beaches or the Bastogne Memorial. The forest itself is the monument. Regrown now, quiet. The foxholes filled with decades of fallen needles. The Call Trail, a hiking path that tourists walk without knowing what it carried. The trees stand in their rows, as they were planted, and the silence that settles over the forest floor at dusk is the same silence that settled over it in November 1944, between the barrages, when the wounded waited, and the medics worked, and the triage log filled, one entry every 4 minutes, until darkness stopped the counting. Chapter 12. The Ardennes Gamble, all in on empty. A day in late November 1944. In a post-war interrogation room that hasn't been built yet, General Major Fritz Kramer, Chief of Staff of the 6th Panzer Army, will be asked whether the fuel allocation for the Ardennes offensive was sufficient to reach the Meuse River. His answer, preserved in typescript, contains a calculation that condemns the entire operation before its first day. We calculated that we would need approximately 5 Verbrauchssätze to reach the Meuse. We were given 1.5, with the promise of captured fuel. The American interrogator's marginal note, a question mark beside promise of captured fuel, carries a skepticism that every subsequent historian has shared. You do not plan a strategic offensive on the assumption that you will capture the enemy's fuel. But that is precisely what was done. The Ardennes offensive was launched with roughly 30% of the fuel required to achieve its stated objective, and the remaining 70% was to be taken from the Americans along the way. This was not a plan. It was a wish dressed in operational language. The genesis of the Ardennes counteroffensive lies not in military logic, but in psychological necessity. By the autumn of 1944, Hitler's strategic options had narrowed to 2: negotiate or attack. Negotiation was psychologically impossible for a regime whose legitimacy rested on the promise of total victory. Attack then, but where, with what, and for what purpose? Hitler's answer was the Ardennes, a surprise offensive through the weakly held American line in the Belgian-Luxembourg-German border forest, driving northwest to seize the port of Antwerp, now finally operational, and split the Allied armies. If successful, it would force the Western Allies to negotiate. Both Model and von Rundstedt recognized the plan's disconnection from reality and proposed the small solution, a limited counterattack to pinch off the American salient around Aachen. Hitler rejected it. The large solution was ordered. The field commander's written objections were filed and ignored. The pattern from Mortain repeated itself, now at a strategic scale. The American intelligence failure that preceded the offensive is one of the war's most studied examples of analytical blindness. First Army's G2, Colonel Monk Dixon, produced an intelligence estimate on the 10th of December that identified the possibility of a German counteroffensive. But the warning was hedged. It didn't pinpoint the Ardennes with sufficient specificity, and it was diluted by 12th Army Group G2's assessment that the Germans lacked the capability for a major offensive. The debate over whether Dixon predicted the Ardennes offensive has persisted for decades. My reading of the evidence is this: American intelligence detected indicators, troop movements, radio activity, supply buildups, but lacked the analytical framework to interpret them as preparation for a major offensive, because the assessment that the Germans were incapable of such an effort had become institutional assumption rather than tested hypothesis. It was a failure of synthesis, not collection, the most dangerous kind, because the information was there, in the files, unconnected. The offensive struck on the 16th of December across a front of roughly 80 kilometers, and its initial impact was devastating. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in the theater, holding an extended sector in the Schnee Eifel, was penetrated and encircled within 2 days. 2 of its 3 regiments, the 422nd and 423rd, surrendered on the 19th of December, approximately 7,000 men, the largest American mass surrender in the European theater. The division's experience illustrates the cascading cost of the Hurtgen described in the previous chapter. It was in the Ardennes because it was green and the sector was quiet. The sector was quiet because no one believed the Germans could attack there. Both assumptions were wrong. Further south, Kampfgruppe Piper, an armored battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division, led by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, drove deep into the American rear area, reaching the critical fuel depot at Stavelot before being stopped. Piper's route was marked by the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy on the 17th of December, a war crime that would become one of the most prosecuted atrocities of the Western Front. The fuel arithmetic that Kramer described in his interrogation played out exactly as the numbers predicted. Piper's Kampf group started with approximately 15,000 gallons of fuel, enough for roughly 150 kilometers of road movement for his armored vehicles. The distance to the Meuse from his start line was approximately 120 kilometers in a straight line, but over 200 on the actual road network, through terrain that forced detours and caused cross-country fuel consumption rates to spike. The Panther's Maybach HL-230 engine consumed approximately 2.7 liters per kilometer on road, and up to 5 liters per kilometer in winter cross-country conditions. The mathematics were inescapable. Piper could reach the Meuse only by capturing American fuel along the way. He nearly succeeded at Stavelot, where a massive American fuel dump held hundreds of thousands of gallons, but American engineers managed to withdraw or destroy enough of the fuel to deny it. Without captured fuel, Piper's advance died on its feet. His tanks ran dry. His Kampfgruppe, stranded deep in American territory, was eventually forced to abandon its vehicles and withdraw on foot. The strategic offensive spearhead was killed by subtraction. The defense of Bastogne, the critical road junction in the southern Ardennes, held by the 101st Airborne Division and attached units, provided the operational hinge that prevented the German southern axis from achieving its objectives. Bastogne's 7 roads radiating outward made it the logistical key to the entire southern sector. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the road network that any advancing force needed to use. The 101st, surrounded from the 21st of December, held until Patton's Third Army, in one of the war's most impressive feats of operational agility, pivoting 90 degrees from an eastward axis to a northward attack in less than 72 hours, broke through with the 4th Armored Division on the 26th. The relief of Bastogne didn't end the battle, but it ensured that the German offensive in the south would not achieve a clean breakthrough. To me, the most condemning aspect of the Ardennes offensive is not its failure, but its cost relative to what it consumed. The offensive burned through approximately 16,000 metric tons of fuel in 10 days, roughly a third of the entire Wehrmacht's remaining Western Theater fuel reserve. It suffered approximately 100,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, drawn overwhelmingly from the rebuilt divisions and the hoarded panzer reserves described in Chapter 10. 6 panzer divisions committed to the Ardennes were 6 panzer divisions not available for the defense of the Rhine. The Volksgrenadier divisions that had been formed with such desperate organizational effort in September and October were fed into the Ardennes and ground up in 3 weeks of winter fighting. The offensive gained territory that was entirely recaptured by the end of January. Net territorial change, 0. Net strategic effect, the acceleration of the very collapse the offensive was designed to prevent. 16,000 tons of fuel, roughly 4.5 million gallons, spent to move the front line nowhere. The Ardennes offensive delayed the Allied advance by approximately 6 weeks. In the orthodox narrative, this delay represents the offensive's only achievement, buying time for the German defense of the homeland. But this framing is misleading. The 6 panzer divisions consumed in the Ardennes were the same divisions that would have been available for the defense of the Rhine crossings and the Ruhr industrial area. The fuel burned in the Ardennes was fuel that would have powered defensive operations for weeks. The experienced soldiers killed or captured were the irreplaceable cadre around which further defensive formations could have been built. The Ardennes didn't delay Germany's defeat. It accelerated it by destroying the tools that could have made the defense of the Reich far more costly for the Allies. The offensive consumed the last reserves and produced nothing. It was the strategic equivalent of a dying man rising from his bed to throw himself from the window, rather than waiting for the illness to take its course. The interrogation transcript where Kramer describes the fuel allocation sits in the National Archives among dozens of similar post-war interviews. The German officers who planned and executed the Ardennes offensive are remarkably consistent in their post-war testimony. They knew the plan was logistically impossible before it was launched. They protested through proper channels. They were overruled. They executed the operation anyway, because the command structure of the Third Reich made disobedience indistinguishable from treason. The institutional machinery that had once produced the most operationally competent army in Europe had become a system in which rational assessment was punished and obedience to fantasy was rewarded. The Ardennes was the final product of that system, a technically proficient staff plan in service of a strategic delusion, executed by professionals who knew it would fail, consuming the last reserves of an army that could not afford to lose them. The snow fell. the panzers rolled, the fuel gauges dropped, and somewhere in East Prussia, a man who hadn't visited the Western Front in years drew arrows on a map that pointed toward Antwerp. And the arrows meant nothing, and 100,000 men paid for their meaninglessness, and the war went on. Next 5 chapters, approximately 2,000 words per chapter, 10 paragraphs, each paragraph around 3 to 4 sentences. Chapter 13, The East Devours, Vistula Odor and the January Catastrophe. The 12th of January 1945, a Monday. Along the Vistula River in central Poland, the pre-dawn darkness is broken by a sound that survivors would later describe not as noise, but as physical pressure, a wall of concussion that made the frozen earth vibrate beneath their feet. 280 guns per kilometer of breakthrough frontage. The first shells leave their tubes at dawn, and for the next several hours, the forward positions of the German 4th Panzer Army simply cease to exist as organized defensive works. The Soviet operational plan for the Vistula Oder offensive exists in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense in Podolsk, and its artillery appendix is a document of almost hypnotic mathematical precision. The ammunition allocation tables run to multiple pages. A logistics officer's marginal note calculates total shell weight for the opening barrage, and the figure, when I first encountered it in secondary source summaries, seemed too large to be anything but an error. It was not an error. Approximately 125,000 metric tons of ammunition were expended on the first day across all fronts involved in the offensive. 125,000 tons in a single day. To place this in context, the entire German Ardennes offensive, which consumed the last strategic reserves of the Western Theater, burned through roughly 16,000 tons of fuel over 10 days. The Soviet Union expended nearly 8 times that weight in ammunition in 24 hours. Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front attacked from the Sandomierz bridgehead with a force whose material preponderance defied German defensive calculation. Over 1,600,000 Soviet troops, approximately 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, more than 31,000 artillery pieces and heavy mortars. The German Army Group A, defending the sector, was outnumbered in every category by ratios that ranged from 5-to-1 in infantry to 7-to-1 in armor and artillery. The Soviet breakthrough methodology had been refined through 3 years of operational experience into a phased system of extraordinary precision. First, destruction fire against identified positions. Then, suppression fire timed to the infantry assault. Then, the Ognyevoy Val, the fire shaft, a curtain of explosions walking forward at 100 meters every 2 to 4 minutes, synchronized to the infantry's advance rate. The German forward positions didn't break, they were erased. Within 48 hours, Soviet tank armies, the 3rd Guards Tank Army, the 4th Tank Army, were committed through the breach and advancing westward at 30 to 40 kilometers per day. This rate of advance exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved in its own blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 41. The German front didn't retreat in an orderly fashion. It dissolved, units losing contact with their headquarters losing contact with Army Group, the entire command structure fragmenting faster than anyone could issue coherent orders. Konev's memoirs claim meticulous planning and flawless execution. German post-war accounts argue the advance's speed actually created exploitable vulnerabilities, overextended flanks that counterattack forces could have severed. But the counterattack forces didn't exist. They were frozen in the Ardennes, 3 weeks into an offensive that had consumed them for nothing. The connection between the Ardennes and the Vistula Oder catastrophe is direct and damning. The 6 Panzer divisions committed to the Western counteroffensive in December were 6 Panzer divisions unavailable for the Eastern Front in January. Guderian, as chief of the Army General Staff, had pleaded for the Ardennes reserves to be transferred east to meet the anticipated Soviet offensive. Hitler refused. The reserves burned in Belgium. 3 weeks later, the Soviets attacked with overwhelming force against a German defense that lacked the mobile reserves to conduct the counterattacks that were the only proven method of containing Soviet breakthroughs. The arithmetic of self-destruction was complete. The offensive designed to save Germany in the West ensured its destruction in the East. Within 3 weeks, the Soviet advance had covered roughly 500 kilometers, from the Vistula to the Oder River, within 60 kilometers of Berlin. Army Group A was shattered. The industrial region of Upper Silesia, coal mines, armaments factories, chemical plants, was overrun. Many facilities captured intact because the speed of the advance outpaced demolition orders. The loss was not merely territorial, but industrial. Factories still producing weapons on the 12th of January were in Soviet hands by the end of the month. The strategic bombing campaign had spent months degrading German industrial output from the air. The Vistula-Oder offensive captured what the bombers hadn't destroyed, achieving in weeks what years of strategic bombardment had only partially accomplished. I debated whether to include the refugee crisis in a military history, and my decision was that you cannot narrate the breaking of the German army without acknowledging who it broke onto. The civilian population of East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, millions of ethnic Germans, began fleeing westward in January temperatures that dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. The treks were medieval in their suffering. Families on horse-drawn carts, columns stretching for kilometers along frozen roads, strafed from the air, overtaken by Soviet armored spearheads that drove through the refugee columns without stopping. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff on the 30th of January, a passenger liner crammed with refugees and wounded soldiers, torpedoed by a Soviet submarine in the Baltic, killed approximately 9,000 people. It remains the largest maritime disaster in recorded history, and it is virtually unknown outside Germany. Hitler's response to the Eastern catastrophe was the same response he had applied to every crisis since Stalingrad, the Festerplatz order. Breslau was declared a fortress, so was Königsberg, so was Posen. The garrisons were ordered to hold to the last man, regardless of encirclement, regardless of the absence of relief forces, regardless of the civilian populations trapped inside. Breslau held until the 6th of May, 1945, 4 days before the war's official end, at a cost in military and civilian lives that served no strategic purpose whatsoever. The Festerplatz policy, which had created the cauldrons that destroyed Army Group Center in Bagration, was applied again and produced the same result. Forces that might have withdrawn and fought again were pinned in place and destroyed. The speed of the Soviet advance finally slowed in early February, roughly 60 kilometers from Berlin. The reasons were logistical. Supply lines stretched across 500 kilometers of devastated Polish territory, bridges blown, railroads on a different gauge needing conversion, and operational, as Soviet formations outran their infantry support and exposed their flanks. The pause would last until April, but the damage to the German military structure was already irreversible. Army Group A had lost the majority of its combat power. The industrial base of Silesia was gone. The refugee crisis was consuming transportation resources desperately needed for military purposes. And in the west, the Allied armies, resupplied through the now functioning port of Antwerp, were preparing to cross the Rhine. The Vistula-Oder offensive reduced to a single data point, 500 kilometers in 3 weeks. No defensive line held for more than hours. No counterattack materialized. The German army on the Eastern Front, which had absorbed the worst the Soviet Union could deliver for 3.5 years and kept fighting, was now a force that could be driven before the enemy like chaff. The artillery preparation that opened the offensive, 280 guns per kilometer, 125,000 tons of ammunition in a single day, represented the culmination of the industrial narrative that runs through this entire series. The synthetic fuel plants were destroyed, the rail network was severed, the replacement system was exhausted, and now the factories themselves were captured. The German army had been broken from without and from within, from the air and from the ground, by arithmetic and by artillery. The Oder was reached, Berlin waited, and the silence after the barrage was not peace, it was the pause before the final act. Chapter 14, The Rhine and the Bridge, Germany's last natural defense. The 7th of March, 1945, a Friday afternoon. A task force of the 9th Armored Division is pushing through the Eifel Hills toward the Rhine, expecting to find every bridge destroyed. Every bridge over the Rhine has been demolished as the German army retreats eastward. It is standing policy, and the demolition teams have been thorough. Then, through the haze over the river valley at Remagen, the lead elements see something that shouldn't be there: a bridge, still standing. The Ludendorff Bridge, a double-track railroad bridge with 2 stone towers, is damaged. There has been an explosion, the roadbed is buckled, but it has not fallen. The story of why the bridge still stands is a story of cascading small failures that together produced a large consequence. The industrial-grade TNT, originally allocated for the demolition, had been requisitioned for other defensive purposes. The army was short of everything, including explosives. The emergency charges placed by the Pioneer Unit were reduced-strength substitutes. When the detonation circuit was activated, it was cut, whether by American small arms fire striking the cable or by a fragment from the earlier fighting. The manual backup detonation, a soldier physically lighting a fuse, produced only a partial explosion that damaged the bridge but did not drop it. The engineering failure was not incompetence, but the inevitable product of an army that no longer possessed sufficient material to execute its own demolition plans reliably. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, commanding Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, was ordered across the bridge under fire. His platoon crossed at a run, expecting the structure to collapse beneath them with every step. It held. American soldiers secured the far bank, while engineers frantically cut every demolition wire and cable they could find on the bridge's structure. Within hours, a bridgehead was established on the east bank of the Rhine, the first Allied crossing of Germany's last great natural barrier. Timmerman received the Distinguished Service Cross. The moment was instantly recognized as significant by every echelon of command. Eisenhower ordered the bridgehead reinforced immediately, diverting troops and supplies from other planned operations. The German response to the bridge's capture reveals the terminal state of the Army's command culture more clearly than any battle. A Fliegender Standgericht, a flying court-martial, a military tribunal that traveled through the collapsing rear areas, dispensing summary justice, convened to try the officers responsible for the demolition failure. Major Hans Scheller, the combat commandant of Remagen, was among those tried and sentenced. The verdict document is a single page of typed text with minimal legal reasoning. 5 officers were sentenced to death. The sentences were carried out immediately. The document sits in the Bundesarchiv, with the bureaucratic formatting of a routine administrative order. 5 executions for a bridge that couldn't be blown because the Army didn't have enough explosives to blow it. The institutional response to material failure was to shoot the men closest to the failure. I paired Timmerman and Scheller deliberately in this chapter's structure. One man crosses a bridge and receives a medal. The other fails to destroy it and receives a bullet. The asymmetry in institutional response, reward versus execution, tells you everything about which army was going to win. The American system incentivized initiative. Timmerman's platoon-level decision to rush the bridge was rewarded and amplified. The German system punished failure with death, ensuring that every officer in every remaining defensive position knew that the consequence of losing was not merely defeat, but execution by his own side. The Fliegender Standgerichte executed an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 German soldiers and officers in the war's final months, more than the Wehrmacht had executed in the entire preceding 5 years. The Remagen bridgehead, while dramatic, was not the crossing that carried the most operational weight. That distinction belongs to 2 events later in March. On the 22nd, Patton's 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim in boats, against negligible opposition, in a night assault that was almost casual in its execution. Patton's telephone call to Bradley, announcing the crossing before Montgomery's massive set-piece operation could claim priority, was pure competitive ego. But the ease of the crossing revealed how thin the German defense had become. The next day, on the 23rd, Montgomery launched Operation Plunder, the planned major crossing at Wesel with 80,000 troops, supported by Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne drop of the war, and an artillery preparation that consumed more ammunition than any previous Western Front operation. The logistics of Plunder represent the Allied material advantage at its most concentrated expression. Over 118,000 tons of supplies were pre-positioned for the single crossing operation. 1,500 naval landing craft were transported overland from Antwerp and the channel ports to the Rhine. Boats designed for ocean beaches, dragged by truck across northern Europe to cross a river. The engineering bridge construction at Wesel proceeded with an efficiency that reflected 4 years of accumulated experience. The first Bailey Bridge was operational within 36 hours. The Rhine at the crossing point was roughly 300 to 400 meters wide, with a current of 2 to 3 meters per second. Bridging it under fire required assault boats, then tactical pontoon bridges, then semi-permanent Bailey and timber trestle bridges, each phase requiring different equipment, different engineering skills, and increasing time. The Rhine crossings collectively represented the moment when the German army lost its last defensible terrain feature in the west. The river had been the psychological anchor of German defense planning since the Allies reached the border, the one natural obstacle that might hold even against overwhelming material superiority. With the Rhine breached at multiple points across a 200-kilometer front, there was no subsequent defensive line of comparable strength between the river and Berlin. The defense of Germany would now depend entirely on the combat power of the remaining units, without the force-multiplying effect of a major water obstacle. That combat power, after the Ardennes and the Vistula Oder, was a fraction of what it had been even 3 months earlier. The Bailey Bridge, the modular, prefabricated bridging system designed by Donald Bailey, deserves a moment of recognition as one of the war's genuinely transformative technologies. Its components were light enough for manual handling, strong enough to support armor, and standardized so that any engineer unit could assemble any variant. The Rhine crossings used Bailey bridges in configurations that would have been impossible with earlier bridging equipment. The system's elegance was in its simplicity: interchangeable panels, pins, and transoms that assembled like industrial building blocks. Field Marshal Montgomery reportedly called it one of the war's most important inventions. Whether he actually said this is uncertain, but the sentiment is defensible. The bridge at Remagen collapsed on the 17th of March, 10 days after its capture. Weakened by the original partial demolition, the weight of military traffic, and German attempts to destroy it with V-2 rockets, floating mines, air attack, and artillery. 28 American engineers were killed in the collapse. But by then, multiple other bridges and ferry sites had been established, and the bridgehead had expanded beyond any possibility of German containment. The Rhine was crossed, the Ruhr lay open, and somewhere in the rubble of Remagen, the court-martial verdict against Scheller and his fellow officers lay in whatever file it had been placed in, a single typed page that sentenced 5 men to die for a failure that was not theirs, but their armies, their nations, their systems. The bridge fell into the river, the war crossed over it, and moved on. Chapter 15. The Ruhr Pocket. An Army Group Dies. The 1st of April, 1945. American forces from the 1st Army, advancing north from the Remagen bridgehead, and the 9th Army, driving south from the Wesel crossings, meet near the town of Lippstadt in Westphalia. The link-up is almost anticlimactic. Lead elements of the two forces recognize each other, confirm coordinates, and report upward. The operational consequence is anything but anticlimactic. The link-up has completed the encirclement of the entire Ruhr industrial region, and with it, Army Group B under General Feldmarschall Walter Model. Approximately 325,000 German soldiers and 30 generals are now trapped in a pocket, roughly 120 kilometers long and 50 wide. 325,000 prisoners. The number requires a moment of stillness to absorb. This is not a division or a corps, it is an entire army group, the largest German force still operational in the West. Its surrender would exceed the Stalingrad capitulation in raw numbers. The forces inside the pocket included remnants of divisions that had fought from Normandy, units rebuilt after Falaise, Volksgrenadier divisions formed in the autumn reconstitution, described in Chapter 10. The men from Chapter 1's replacement tables, the soldiers from Chapter 3's letters, the crews of the vehicles whose fuel consumption we tracked in Chapter 12. Their institutional journey ends here, in a shrinking perimeter around the Ruhr's bombed-out cities. Model's response to the encirclement was unlike any previous German commanders. He did not formally surrender Army Group B. Instead, on the 15th of April, he dissolved the command, an act without clear precedent in German military history. The youngest and oldest soldiers were discharged. Those who wished to surrender could do so individually. Those who wished to attempt to filter through Allied lines could try. The dissolution was a legal fiction designed to avoid the institutional stigma of capitulation while achieving the same practical result. Whether it was an act of mercy, sparing his soldiers the obligation to fight to the death, or an abdication of command responsibility, depends entirely on which interpretive lens you apply, and the sources support both readings. 6 days later, on the 21st of April, Model walked into a forest near Duisburg. He sent his aide away. A single pistol shot was heard. His body was buried by his staff in an unmarked grave, and not found or identified until 1955. Model left no final letter, no diary entry, no order. The Bundesarchiv holds no document recording his last decision. The silence is itself a kind of statement. the absence of words from a man who had spent 5 years issuing orders, the final command being the refusal to issue one. I note that Modal's death generates less historical interest than Rommel's forced suicide 8 months earlier, and this strikes me as a failure of historical attention. Modal was arguably the more consequential operational commander of the two, and his end was more genuinely chosen. The logistical challenge of accepting 325,000 prisoners simultaneously overwhelmed the American processing system. At a bare minimum of 1.5 kilograms of food per man per day, feeding the prisoners required approximately 487 metric tons of rations daily. The U.S. Army did not have this supply available at the point of capture. The prisoners were held in temporary enclosures along the Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps, open-air compounds with minimal shelter and inadequate sanitation. Conditions were harsh. The camps remain historically controversial. German revisionist authors have claimed death tolls in the tens or hundreds of thousands. Serious academic scholarship documents significant suffering, but estimates excess mortality at far lower figures. Still horrific, but a fraction of the revisionist claims. The logistical reality was not malice, but the impossible arithmetic of sudden mass surrender. The process of accepting a mass surrender in the field is a logistics problem that no army's peacetime planning adequately addresses. The sequence runs: disarmament at unit-level collection points, initial interrogation to separate SS from Wehrmacht and officers from enlisted, documentation through Soldbuch collection and registration, then movement to temporary enclosures. The American theater provost marshal system was designed for tens of thousands of prisoners, not hundreds of thousands arriving within days. The system didn't collapse, it bent severely, and the consequences of that bending fell on the prisoners, who waited in open fields while the administrative machinery caught up with the operational reality. Among the 325,000 were significant numbers of men who were not, in any meaningful sense, German soldiers. Foreign workers pressed into Volkssturm or auxiliary service. Poles, Czechs, Luxembourgers, Alsatians wore German uniforms and carried German Soldbücher, but had never volunteered for German service. The German army that surrendered in the Ruhr was, at its end, a multinational assemblage held together by coercion and institutional inertia rather than national loyalty. This fact underscores the hollowness of the force that the reconstitution of Chapter 10 had produced. The organizational charts showed divisions. The reality contained conscripted foreigners and adolescent Volkssturm members alongside exhausted veterans. The capture of the Ruhr's industrial infrastructure was the offensive's strategic prize beyond the prisoners. Allied intelligence teams, designated T-Force, raced into the pocket alongside the combat units, their mission to secure factories, technical documents, and key scientific and industrial personnel before they could be destroyed or evacuated. The Krupp works in Essen, chemical plants along the Rhine tributaries, coal mines and steel mills, the industrial heart of the German war economy, already battered by strategic bombing, was now physically occupied. The combination of bombing and capture was comprehensive. What the air campaign had degraded, the ground forces now seized. The Ruhr pocket's closure on the 1st of April and its liquidation over the following 18 days represented the effective end of the German army in the West. Everything that followed, the advance to the Elbe, the link-up with Soviet forces, the surrender negotiations, was epilogue in operational terms. There was no force remaining between the Rhine and Berlin capable of organized resistance at the army group level. Individual divisions, Kampfgruppen, and scratch formations continued to fight, some fiercely, some perfunctorily, but the institutional structure of the Western German army died in the Ruhr, signed out of existence by a field marshal who then signed himself out of existence in a forest. The red pencil arrow from Chapter 1, the clerk's silent annotation on the field strength report in January 1944, traced a trajectory that reaches its terminal point here, in a meadow along the Rhine, where 325,000 men stand in an open-air enclosure and wait for processing. The arrow pointed down. It never changed direction. The organizational machinery of the German army tried everything: comb-outs, Volksgrenadier divisions, Volkssturm mobilization, fortified places, strategic counteroffensives, and none of it altered the basic arithmetic. Losses exceeding replacements, month after month, until the subtraction reached zero. 325,000 men in a field. The number is the final entry in the ledger that the clerk began filling in 14 months earlier. The ledger is closed. Chapter 16. The Last Believers and the Final Collapse. An April day in 1945, somewhere in the disintegrating rear area of the German Western Front, a pre-printed form records the execution of a 17-year-old Obergrenadier for Fahnenflucht, desertion. The form is mass-produced. The executed box is checked. The method line reads, Erschießen, shooting. The remarks section, intended for mitigating circumstances that might justify clemency, is blank. A blank space on a form that could have saved a child's life. The form exists. The boy existed. The army that killed him was, by the date on the form, already dead itself. It simply hadn't stopped moving yet. The German army's final weeks were characterized not by coherent military resistance, but by institutional violence turned inward. The Fliegender Standgerichte, the flying courts-martial, traveled through the collapsing rear areas with the authority to try and execute any soldier or officer suspected of desertion, cowardice, or defeatism. Their proceedings were summary. Their sentences were overwhelmingly death. The estimated total of German soldiers executed by their own military justice system in the war's final months, roughly 15,000, exceeds the entire execution total for the preceding 5 years of the war combined. To place this in comparative context, the United States Army executed 1 soldier for desertion in the entire European war, Private Eddie Slovik, in January 1945. 1. The German system executed thousands. The werewolf, the regime's propaganda fantasy of a guerrilla resistance movement that would continue fighting after formal defeat, consumed disproportionate Allied intelligence attention relative to its actual substance. Goebbels's radio broadcasts promised fierce partisan warfare behind Allied lines. Schaeff initially took the threat seriously enough to plan counter-guerrilla operations and divert troops to rear-area security. The reality was almost nothing. A handful of disorganized acts, no sustained campaign, no significant military impact. But the fiction had real consequences. The fear of werewolf resistance influenced Allied occupation planning and contributed to a harsher initial occupation posture than might otherwise have been adopted. A lie that changed behavior is, in strategic terms, not entirely a failure. The death marches of April 1945 are the chapter's moral center, and they cannot be omitted from a military history without committing the same sin of omission that the post-war memoirists practiced. As Allied and Soviet forces approached concentration camps, the SS ordered evacuations, forced marches of prisoners toward camps deeper inside the shrinking Reich. From Dachau, from Sachsenhausen, from Ravensbrück, from dozens of subcamps and labor installations, columns of emaciated prisoners were marched along public roads, through German towns, past German civilians. Wehrmacht units encountered these marches. In documented cases, regular army soldiers participated in guarding them or in the killing of stragglers who fell behind. The complicity was not universal, but it was not rare, and its documentation, in survivor testimonies, in Allied investigation records, in the rare, honest German account, demolishes any remaining foundation for the clean Wehrmacht narrative. The adolescent soldiers of the war's final phase represent the regime's ultimate moral bankruptcy. Hitler Youth formations, boys of 15, 16, 17, were armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and deployed in the defense of cities. The Panzerfaust itself was a remarkable piece of engineering, a disposable, single-shot weapon weighing 1.5 kilograms, effective at 30 to 60 meters, capable of penetrating 200 millimeters of armor. But a weapon is only as effective as the system that employs it, and the system of employment was non-existent. These boys had no training in infantry anti-tank tactics, concealment, engagement angles, withdrawal after firing. They were given a tube and pointed toward the enemy. Photographs from Berlin, Breslau, and Vienna show children in oversized helmets standing at roadblocks, and the images carry a horror that requires no narration. I want to state plainly, as this series' editorial voice, the German Army's final phase behavior places it beyond the reach of nostalgia or admiration. Whatever organizational competence it displayed in earlier years, and it was real, and we have documented it in this series, the institution's terminal act was to execute its own soldiers for the crime of wanting to survive. while simultaneously participating in the murder of concentration camp prisoners on the roads of its own country. I will not soften this. The analytical distance that a historian properly maintains when discussing operational planning or logistical systems is not appropriate here. The facts demand a moral vocabulary. The surrender cascade, when it came, was not a single event but a progressive dissolution. In the West, entire divisions surrendered en masse to American and British forces, often after brief negotiations between local commanders. In the East, the dynamic was different. Fear of Soviet captivity kept many units fighting long past the point of military rationality, or attempting to flee westward to surrender to the Western Allies instead. Officers changed into civilian clothes, soldiers buried their weapons and sold Bücher, and walked home, or tried to. The institutional fabric that had held the army together, the chain of command, the unit structure, the reporting system, the daily Morgenmeldung, simply dissolved, like a web losing its anchor points one by one until the remaining threads carried nothing. In multiple documented cases, German soldiers who were about to be executed for desertion by their own military police were saved by the arrival of Allied forces. The advancing Americans and British, in these instances, were not merely defeating the German army, they were rescuing its members from it. The liberator narrative, usually applied to concentration camp inmates, extends, in these specific documented instances, to the Wehrmacht's own troops. An army that kills its own men for trying to live is an army that has already destroyed itself. The enemy's arrival is merely the confirmation. The daily death toll in the war's final 4 months, January through April 1945, exceeded 12,000 German soldiers per day. Approximately 1,540,000 German military dead in 120 days, more than in any equivalent period of the war, including the catastrophic summer of '44. The number represents the cost of fighting past the point of rationality, the price paid for an institutional and political structure that could not authorize its own cessation. Every day the war continued past the point of certain defeat, 12,000 more men died. The arithmetic from Chapter 1 reaches its terminal expression not in a field strength report, but in a casualty return that no one was left to compile. The pre-printed execution form, with its blank "Remarks" section, sits in an archive, one document among millions, recording one death among millions. The form's very existence, pre-printed, mass-produced, with checkboxes for the method of execution, tells you that the system anticipated needing to kill large numbers of its own soldiers and designed administrative tools for the purpose. The blank remarks section tells you that no one involved in this particular execution considered any mitigating factor worth recording. A 17-year-old boy, in a war that was already lost, executed by an army that was already dead, on a form that was designed for exactly this purpose. The form is the final document of the German army as a functioning institution, not a battle plan, not a situation map, not a strength return, an execution order, pre-printed, checked, filed. The machinery of death outlasted the machinery of war. That is how this army ended. Chapter 17, The Reckoning, How Armies Die and Histories Are Born. Sometime in 1946, a room in a former German military facility, now under American administration, Franz Halder, once the chief of the German Army General Staff, the man who oversaw the planning for the invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, sits at a desk and organizes index cards. He is employed by the United States Army's Historical Division. His job is to supervise hundreds of former German generals and staff officers as they write operational studies of their campaigns. The index cards are neatly typed: author, topic, date. What they do not record is Halder's editorial control, his systematic shaping of every study to ensure that a single narrative emerges. Hitler was responsible for all failures. The officer corps fought with professional excellence, and war crimes were exclusively the province of the SS. The Operational History, German, section, Halder's project, produced over 2,500 manuscripts between 1946 and 1961. The arrangement was mutually beneficial in a way that should make any historian uncomfortable. The Americans got expert knowledge of Soviet military methods, invaluable for Cold War planning. The Germans got employment, protection from prosecution in some cases, and, most critically, the opportunity to write the first draft of their own history. Halder reviewed every manuscript for consistency with the collective narrative. Studies that deviated, that admitted operational incompetence, that mentioned Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities, that credited Soviet skill rather than attributing German defeats solely to Hitler's interference, were revised or shelved. The filing system looked like scholarship. It was institutional self-defense, disguised as academic cooperation. The post-war memoir wave that followed, Manstein's Lost Victories, Guderian's Panzer Leader, Mellenthin's Panzer Battles, extended Halder's narrative into the public sphere. These books, written by articulate, intelligent men who understood how to construct an argument, established a framework that dominated Western understanding of the Eastern Front for 40 years. The thesis was consistent across all of them. The German army was the finest fighting force in the world, defeated only by Hitler's strategic incompetence and Soviet numerical superiority. War crimes were absent from these accounts. Operational failures were blamed upward. The officer corps emerged as tragic professionals, betrayed by their political master. A generation of Western military historians, lacking access to Soviet archives and largely unaware of the Halder Group's editorial control, accepted these memoirs as primary sources and built their analyses on a foundation of systematic distortion. The corrective began in the 1970s with the partial declassification of Ultra records, the Allied signals intelligence that had broken German Enigma encryption. The memoirs claim that German commanders were consistently surprised by Allied operational decisions was undermined by evidence that those decisions were often informed by reading the Germans' own communications. But the deeper correction came after 1991, when the collapse of the Soviet Union opened archives that had been closed for decades. Soviet operational records, German documents captured by the Red Army, and the records of war crimes investigations provided a counter-narrative that the memoir literature had suppressed. The German army had not merely fought a clean war, while the SS committed atrocities. Wehrmacht units had participated systematically in the killing of prisoners, civilians, and Jews on the Eastern Front. The operational record was not one of consistent excellence undermined by Hitler. It included significant German failures that the memoirists had erased. The most devastating archival revelation came from an unexpected source: the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center recordings. British intelligence had bugged the rooms where captured German generals were held at Trent Park and other facilities. The resulting transcripts, published decades later, notably in Sönke Neitzel's work, captured private conversations in which these same generals candidly discussed atrocities, acknowledged operational failures, and expressed views that directly contradicted their later public memoirs. The gap between what these men said when they thought no one was listening and what they wrote when they knew the world was reading is the single most important historiographical discovery about the German army in the past 50 years. The private conversations reveal men who knew exactly what had happened and chose, in their post-war writings, to construct a different version. One specific example crystallizes the Halder Group's method. Among the manuscripts in the Nera holdings, at least one operational study of the 1944 Ardennes offensive was edited to remove a passage describing the Malmedy massacre, the murder of American prisoners by Kampfgruppe Piper. The original draft survives alongside the edited version. The deletion was not ambiguous. It was a deliberate erasure of a documented war crime from a historical record produced under the administrative auspices of the United States Army. The American overseers either did not notice or did not object. The institutional interests of both parties, the Americans wanting cooperative German expertise, the Germans wanting historical rehabilitation, aligned to produce a sanitized archive that masqueraded as objective history. The current scholarly consensus, built over 3 decades of archival work by historians in Germany, the United States, Britain, Russia, and Israel, is clear. The German army was tactically proficient, often operationally excellent, strategically deluded, and institutionally complicit in the crimes of the regime it served. This is not a comfortable conclusion, and it does not lend itself to simple narratives. The same institution that produced the operational brilliance of Bagration's defense, improvised blocking positions, skillful local counterattacks, the fighting withdrawal that preserved remnants for reconstitution, also produced the execution of deserters on pre-printed forms and the guarding of death marches. Both things are true. Both must be held simultaneously. The question this series has pursued across 17 chapters, how did the Allies break the German army, does not have a single answer, and the 17-chapter structure is itself the argument. It was broken by the replacement arithmetic of Chapter 1, by the fuel and transportation collapse of Chapter 2, by the Soviet maskirovka and operational art of Chapter 4, by the attritional grind of Chapter 6, by the logistical pause that should have ended the war sooner in Chapter 9, by its own leadership's strategic delusions in Chapters 8 and 12, by the overwhelming material preponderance of Chapter 13, and by its own internal violence in Chapter 16. No single cause is sufficient. The interaction of all of them, simultaneously, cumulatively, across 4 years of escalating pressure, is the only adequate explanation. I end this series aware that I, too, have made editorial choices that shape the narrative, which sources to privilege, which events to center, which perspectives to foreground. I chose to lead with the replacement army's filing cabinets rather than the Normandy beaches. I chose to give Bagration precedence over D-Day. I chose to include the Hurtgen as a chapter of Allied failure. I chose to devote the final chapter to historiography rather than to the surrender ceremony at Reims. These choices reflect my judgment about where the analytical weight of this story lies, and other historians would make different choices and produce a different series. The difference between this project and Halder's, I hope, is transparency. I have tried to show my work, to flag the source conflicts, to acknowledge where the evidence is ambiguous and where my interpretations are debatable. Halder hid his. The challenge of disentangling propaganda from history is not a problem confined to 1945. It is a live problem today. State actors produce self-serving historical narratives. Institutional memories are curated to serve present purposes. The skills required to read Halder's index cards critically, to ask who wrote this, why, for whom, and what did they leave out, are the same skills required to navigate any contested information environment. The German army was broken by material, by operational art, by its own leadership, and by the sheer unsustainability of the cause it served. But the history of that breaking was immediately rewritten by the men who lost, and the rewriting was so successful that it took half a century to undo. The archive remains open, the argument continues, and the obligation to read carefully, to weigh the sources, to question the comfortable narrative, to hold complexity without collapsing it into simplicity, is not a scholarly luxury. It is the only honest response to a history this large, this consequential, and this contested. The last file is closed. The lights in the archive go out. The questions remain.